Hey family, welcome back to my video. Today we will see, what if Harry Potter went back with Minerva to change his destiny? Before we start, I would like to extend my sincere thanks to the original author of this story for granting us permission to use it in our YouTube video. Your generosity is greatly appreciated. The author's creation and the original story's link in the descriptions. Please do check that first. Now enjoy the video. Tom smiled as he stared at the bodies lying before him. They were so very small but looked so peaceful lying there. The final trickle of life left them, wiping away the last vestiges of his incorporeal form. As he became wholly flesh once more, so too did the world around him grow tangible. His heartbeat for the first time in the decade since he sealed his fractured soul in the diary felt like thunder in his chest. The blood in his veins was like fire. He smiled wider at the pain of hunger gnawed at his stomach and exhaustion begging him to go to bed. The loss of the basilisk was a setback, true, but he was alive and whole. He had a wand shockingly well suited to him, and once he sealed the chamber, he had plenty of time to recover, not least of all because of the metric tons of snake meat available to him. It was an unappealing prospect, eating his dead friend for sustenance, but it would be necessary. He laughed, that mirthless, thrilled laughter that turned even the most hard-headed Slytherin upperclassman subservient. "Lily, take Harry and go!" An unfamiliar voice yelled unbearably loud in his ear. Tom yelped and fell to his knees at the ear-splitting voice echoing off the chamber walls. No, not the chamber. The chamber was gone, and he was somewhere else. "It's him. I'll hold him off." The voice returned, as loud as a hurricane. Tom was moving, as if being carried. He saw curtains of red beyond which was a small foyer. He was ascending up a flight of stairs. Wooden rails on one side and framed photos on the other whizzed past his vision in a blur. The last thing, he was the back of a man with familiar, messy black hair, and the front door he was facing blowing in as if by an explosive device. The sound of a high-pitched cackles made his newly warm blood freeze. "Get out!" Tom demanded as he clutched his head. "Get out of my head!" He ripped himself from the vision, the illusion that put all manner of mind or sensory manipulation magic he'd ever encountered to shame. He was back inside of the Chamber of Secrets, kneeling above the two dead children. Something was standing over him. A pale, emaciated corpse covered in what looked like amniotic fluid. It was specifically standing over Harry, and Tom could feel it staring down at him. He tried to look up from its feet to its face, but the vision returned before he saw any more of the creatures. "Not Harry. Please have mercy, have mercy. Not Harry. Not Harry. Please, I'll do anything." A woman's voice pleaded. Tom saw her through the wooden bars of a crib. His little, pudgy hands gripped the bars as hard as his one-year-old body could manage. "Stand aside. You silly girl, stand aside now." Tom heard the high-pitched voice that laughed before ordered the woman. She stood strong, arms outstretched protectively over him. And for the life of him, Tom couldn't understand why anybody would pout their life on the line for a monster like him, let alone this beautiful woman. "Not Harry. Please, no. Take me. Kill me instead, Dash," his mother pleaded for his life. The shrill voice, coming from a black shape beyond his mother and the doorway she was blocking. Without warning, the nursery filled with the bright green light of the killing curse, and the woman screamed. Screamed so loud the entire cottage shook with the force. He knew she shouldn't have been able to do that. To make a single sound once the killing curse hit her was impossible. It was instant, painless death, but that scream held in it so much agony and lasted well after the curse faded before she fell dead on the ground. Tom tried to call out to her, to plead for her to still be alive, to curse the name of the creature, now stepping over her lifeless body towards him as it advanced upon baby Tom Riddle. He was crying. He felt the tears running down his cheeks and heard his baby voice wailing, and he could barely see the red-eyed face of the monster standing over his crib. The eyes were all he could see clearly beneath the hood, and they held an impossible hatred for anybody to have towards a baby. The monster left his wand out to little Tom, and he went cross-eyed in order to stare directly at the tip of the familiar length of yew and phoenix feather. When the tip glowed green, Tom suddenly knew exactly how painful Lily's death had been as he felt that same pain in his forehead and screamed as loud as she had. At first from the remembered pain of the killing curse striking him in the forehead, and then the flood of memories and emotions that filled his mind. No, he cried out as the foreign memories flooded his mind. Memories that were both his and yet not his. Everything Harry had experienced in life and in death came to him. He remembered how he had punished Dudley at the reptile exhibit, just as he'd punished Billy Stubbs for feeding Helvetica to his rabbit. He remembered the cruel words and apathy of his aunt and uncle, almost as cold as the apathy of those public servants who took jobs at the orphanage for the sick pleasure of being in control of people weaker than them. A stepping stone to their precious future careers in politics or social care. Tom remembered the violence inflicted on him by his older cousin and by the even older foster siblings. How he had run and hid from the many bullies. How he discovered magic accidentally. But then the two sets of memories stopped echoing. He remembered two different lives. One in which he feared his magic and tried to rationalize it. Another in which he embraced it, played with it, experimented with, and mastered it. He remembered going to Diagon Alley for the first time. Twice. The first time he went alone, harboring suspicion and unease. The first time with a giant beside him, giving words of kindness and tragedy. Then memories he couldn't even pretend were his own came to the fore. Tom realized they were not Harry's memories. They belonged to something else, something inside of Harry. Something trapped in a malignant, tar-like darkness and a suffocating silence. Its only window to the world, a lightning-shaped crack in its prison through which it peered and saw the outside world. He saw the shattered home and his slain mother laid on the floor. He saw the half-giant who tried so desperately to be Tom's friend when they attended Hogwarts only to be betrayed in the end, lift him up from the rubble and wrap him in a blanket. He watched as he fell asleep, looking up at an ocean of stars with the roar of a motorcycle as his lullaby. 12 years. 12 years of life experienced in a fraction of a second. That is what he remembered, and it was too much for him. Too much for his new brain to process. Hopes, dreams, memories, and emotions. I'm so sorry. Tom Riddle choked on the words as he picked the limp children up and cradled their heads in his chest. He remembered everything. The good, the bad. Most importantly, he remembered that twisted, monstrous face protruding from the back of another man's head. The thing he was destined to become. The thing he had become. The thing that had brought upon Harry and countless other children the same cold and loveless childhood he had suffered through. He tried to vomit, but all his empty stomach could yield was the bile now staining his front. Why? Why had Ginny Weasley painted Lord Voldemort as a great and powerful sorcerer when writing to him? So mighty that people dare not speak his name for fear of his wrath. That's not what he saw, not what these memories showed. What he saw was a disgusting, loathsome creature of cowardice and a parasite to boot. That Voldemort was a wretch, worthy of nothing but contempt and perhaps pity. Weak and disgusting. That's not what he envisioned. That's not what he set out to become. That was not a man of greatness uniting the disparate magical communities into a new order he was meant to become. He choked on the scream as it came out. Strange things like sadness and horror and fury are what he yelled to the heavens. His scream hit cold, uncaring rock and echoed endlessly back to him. Weak, ineffectual, and as pointless as his attempts to rouse the two children back from the dead by shaking them. These emotions were not his own. Unlike the disgust and shame at what he saw, these emotions were filling him from the outside, but just like the memories, he couldn't parse the two apart. In that moment of despair, disgust, horror, and rage, a smidgen of another feeling, one entirely new to Tom Marvolo Riddle, peeked through the mass of emotions tearing at his insides. A smidgen of remorse in a typhoon of anger and misery blossomed. A smidgen is all that was needed. In that moment, two broken pieces of a soul became one, and Tom Riddle knew nothing else but pain. Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore led his contemporaries through the rubble. Minerva, Severus, Pomona, and Filius followed him with drawn wands. Poppy took up the rear, carrying a rucksack nearly as large as she was. It was filled with bandages, healing salves and potions of esoteric medical application. He kept his charms professor and potions master close, making sure that he was flanked by the only two people in 1,000 miles with more skill in their respective professions than he had. Save for Pomfrey, Professors Sprout and McGonagall flanked the school healer and had orders to close off the entrance with herbological and transfiguration magic should the first three fall. He would have had Minerva at his side in place of Sirius were it not for the fact that his own skills at transfiguration were far superior to hers, and the strategic advantages of having a charms master and someone knowledgeable of the dark arts taking point with him over a fellow master of transfiguring. At least that's what he told the younger woman, knowing that the truth of his chivalrous designs would only infuriate her and his other fair companions. They reached something like a vault door. It stood ajar, and they carefully surrounded the sides, Flitwick ducking low to keep out of sight as he dashed to the other end, and Severus taking the right. With his 2 point men pressed against the sides of the vault door, Albus walked through the gaping portal and into a massive, truly awe-inspiring chamber. He squashed the childlike giddiness and desire to explore before it could rise up. The serpent statues, the elephantine pipeways, the smooth artisan floor and ceiling. They all begged him to investigate, but he refused those feelings in lieu of the urgent matter at hand. They descended a steel ladder one at a time, the others keeping their wands at the ready to defend or catch their climbing partners at a moment's notice. Minerva, Pomona, Poppy, please remain behind near the vault door and make certain it remains open and to prevent anything from sneaking up on them. Albus ordered them, and should we fall, seal it behind us so the basilisk may not get loose. Their escape route thus secured, the 3 men continued forward. The 3 combat-hardened wizards skulked between the snake statues with no shortage of apprehension. Any one of them could be the real thing hidden by the dim light, and Albus was positive he wasn't the only one who didn't like their chances against the beast Mr. Weasley warned them about. Even with the help of the other professors, they were woefully unprepared to take down such a creature. Flip, thunk, flip, thunk. Albus raised a hand to stop his companions. He recognized the first sound as pages in a book turning. The second was more difficult to place. He motioned for the other 2 to take cover behind the statues on either side of him, and they obeyed. Severus waded into the rancid, waist-high water without a sound. The poor part goblin found himself completely submerged in the liquid, but paddled along anyways. In a less tense situation, Albus would have chuckled at his old dueling opponent's misfortune. Instead, he showed a modicum of professionalism and merely grinned like a Cheshire cat as the trio advanced. That smile vanished at the horrific scene before him. It wasn't every day a wizard, headmaster or no, laid eyes on a millennial-old basilisk. The sight of the felled beast brought a great deal of relief and hope for the safety of his students, but that relief and hope soon vanished, replaced with sadness and despair at the smaller figures beside it. He recognized 2 as Harry Potter and Ginevra Weasley. The third was larger and a few meters further away. He had his back to them. Flip, thunk, flip, thunk. The young man was kneeling over something, a book by the sound of it, a book whose pages he turned before bringing something large and white down on it in a stabbing motion. A phoenix, his phoenix, stood next to the man with its head on his shoulder, letting loose the occasional trill like a mother cooing her child. Albus kept his wand trained on the young man, who he recognized must have been an upperclassman, 6th or 7th year. He couldn't tell who from this position or distance. He crept closer. Flip, thunk, flip, thunk. He crept closer still, and when he reached the 2 children, he motioned for Severus and Sirius to remain hidden. Flip, thunk, flip, thunk. Albus reached down with his free hand, not daring to peel his eyes away from the mystery man in front of him. He checked Ginny Weasley for any sign of life, but could feel no breath from her mouth, pulse from her neck, nor heat on her skin. Hoping against hope, he pushed his magic into her body to see if her own internal magic would reject it, like a magnet repelling another of the same kind. It wasn't the easiest way of checking to see if somebody was alive, and only truly powerful wizards could attempt such a trick, and only then to check if there was any chance of resuscitation or revival. Nothing. His magic passed through her dead body like any other lifeless matter. He did the same for Harry, skipping the regular breath, pulse, and body heat checks. Again, nothing. Flip. Thunk. Albus motioned again for the others to hold their positions before indicating that the two students were dead. He motioned for them to stay again when he heard the splash of Sirius taking a step forward. He felt the potion's master tap on his occlumency shields with his own legitimacy, as he often did when asking permission to speak privately via the mind arts. Even with his shields up, he could sense the fury and desperation of the man and desire to confirm with his own senses what his headmaster claimed. Albus ignored it and approached the kneeling teenager. The only thing preventing him from killing the figure then, and there was not his desire to know what happened. Who this boy could be. Theories on illegitimate love children of Voldemort had been going around as of late, but the sight of Fawkes crying on his shoulder. The poor bird never could understand that its tears weren't capable of healing those kinds of injuries. Albus had never known him to shed a tear for the undeserving. Flip. Albus tensed as the young man raised his arm to stab the leather-bound book again, but stopped mid-swing. He was close enough now to recognize the thing in his hands as an ivory tooth. A fong previously belonging to the basilisk, no doubt. Before he could wonder what a perfectly unused journal had done to deserve such harsh treatment, the boy, turned to look at him. Tom! Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore gasped as he, for the first time in a century, dropped his wand. He picked it up again just as the puffy-eyed, red-faced and bile-covered boy dropped his own weapon with a clatter. "Professor," he choked out with trembling lips. It came out as more of a gurgle than a word as it left his throat. All theories of time anomalies, wormholes flinging students into far-off futures, and multiverse jumping left his mind at the sight of the Slytherin in such a vulnerable state. Tom motioned to the two dead students as his mouth fought desperately to form words, but no sound came out of him. "What are you doing here, Tom?" Albus asked in a manner as if finding an underage incarnation of the greatest Dark Lord in history in a legendary chamber beneath Hogwarts, stabbing a nearly featureless book with a venomous fong pilfered from a recently slayed basilisk beside two dead children was a daily occurrence. I was, he said, motioning from Harry to the book. "I was trying to take it all back." Albus understood. Some way, somehow, he understood. He had heard many men stronger, older, and wiser than Tom say those exact same words. He was one of them. And this 16-year-old boy, a child in his own right, wished for something he himself wished for. Every time he visited the man he once loved in that dreadful prison. A mulligan to undo all of the horrible things that happened in the interim he missed, or the consequences of his actions and inactions. Thunk! Albus jumped at the sound. He hadn't even noticed Tom retrieve the fong until he plunged it into yet another page of the seemingly unused journal. "But I can't," he gurgled out in his attempt at yelling, but with what came out barely above a whisper. He left the fong buried in the pages. "God help me. I can't take any of it back, no matter how badly I want." Tom wept. Albus, keeping his wand trained on the anomaly before him, dared to share the slightest humanity by reaching out with his spare hand and placing it comfortably on his new prisoner's shoulder. Tom reacted instantly, flinging himself at Dumbledore in a very unexpected and very unwelcome hug. Albus could merely kneel stock still as Tom wailed into his chest as he clawed meekly against his robes and back. "Why?" he pleaded. "Why can't I take it back?" Azkaban prison. Sirius Black tossed the flimsy pillow across his cell, giving up on any chance of tuning out the raucous echoing throughout the prison. It landed with an unheard thud against the stone wall as the prison shook again. When typhoons passed over the island of Azkaban, half of the cells in the prison find themselves submerged beneath the rising tide. His was one of those cells. The only reason he wasn't drowning at the moment was due to the water-repelling enchantments on the bars of his window. It gave the impression of being trapped in an air bubble beneath the sea. Yet one more trick of psychological torture for the prisoners. Naturally, the magic didn't keep all of the water out, as the interior of his cell was completely soaked, its occupant very much included. When another flash of lightning illuminated his cell, he retrieved the soggy sack of feathers and wrung it out. He couldn't even hear the water falling to the stone floor over the howling of the wind, roaring of thunder, and yelling of other prisoners. He shifted back into Padfoot and carried it back to the bed with his jaws. No matter how long one remained trapped in Azkaban, the terror of these storms never left them. The wind howling through the prison's halls sounded so very much like the hollow breathing of the prison guards. Dementors are terrible enough company when the sun shone, but are so much worse when the prison submerged. Did you know Dementors can swim? Because before his arrest, Sirius was blissfully unaware of that fact. He made the mistake of looking through the bars during one of these storms once. And that was one time too many. The sight of the ghostly, cloaked figures submerged and illuminated by brief flashes was like a glimpse into hell itself. They were like the spirits of drowning victims turned inferi and encircling their helpless prey. They occasionally cast a shadow into prisoner cells with the flashes of nature's wrath, adding to the nightmare. The Dementors were especially riled up as of late. Their slow feeding on the prisoners had erupted into a veritable feast 3 hours ago. That's when the screaming began. From every level, in every hallway, prisoners hooted and hollered in joy and excitement. In no small amount of madness. The guards haven't figured out why, and they probably didn't care. All they knew is that their herd of cattle were suddenly producing happy memories faster than they could consume them. The usual luxuries of cigarettes and narcotics given to prisoners to increase yields were long forgotten in piles between cells. The other prisoners had continued to yell and bang on the cages ever since, and for the life of him, Sirius couldn't figure out why. Like the Dementors, though, he didn't care. He wanted to sleep and escape the suffering of those memories. But as a dog, his hearing was more sensitive, and the noise was deafening. As a man, the nightmares were too much to bear. No, 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 no. The man in the cell adjacent to us screamed again. He can't be back. He can't. I destroyed it. Sirius' patience finally ran out. The man had ranted and raved and screamed nonstop since the rest of the screaming began. Unlike theirs, his shrieks held no joy, only rage and despair. The usual for prisoners of Azkaban. He thrashed around his cell, and in the flashes of lighting, Sirius could see he was covered in blood from where his shackles cut into his wrist and ankles as he desperately tried to break out. His wounds would no doubt look worse once daylight finally pierced their windows. He was kind of pathetic, but that's what Sirius had come to expect from the man. Pathetic things. "YEA!" The man screeched, sending Sirius' ears ringing. He transformed back into the form of man, taking great care and placing his paws into the shackles before doing so to make sure they clasped his wrist when he finished, and approached the bars of his own cell. "What is it?" Sirius yelled across the hallway. "Who's back? What is it that you destroyed?" It was a long shot trying to get a coherent answer out of a man driven insane by this hellish place. The only reason Sirius wasn't equally bad off was the rage brought about by the knowledge of his innocence keeping him warm at night. To say nothing of his contentedness with being there. He deserved this, as did the man across the hallway. To Sirius' surprise, the man became lucid before his very eyes and came running to his cell bars to look at him. Another flash of lightning lit the prison, and they stared at each other's equally decrepit forms. That's when Sirius saw it. That's when the pieces fell into place. The dark mark, red and inflamed, shone on his neighbor's glistening wrist. Sirius prayed that he was mistaken, hoped it was a trick of the light, but he knew it to be true. His Horcrux, Regulus Arcturus Black, told his brother. "I destroyed his fucking Horcrux. Want your story written? I take commissions now. You can pay me to write your fanfiction or original works. My prices are as follows. $25 per 1,000 words of fanfiction, with some wiggle room. I don't pad my work. You also get to video chat with me as I type the first chapter. $25 per 500 words for original works, so anything that is not fanfiction. I also charge $25 per 500 words for smut or fetish materials. Price is subject to change in the future. Check with me. Become a patron. NonsensicalRants. You can also still become a patron for $1 to get access to future chapters 2 weeks early and vote on which stories I update next. 2. Our Different Prisons. Chapter 2. Our Different Prisons. For the third day in a row, Tom Riddle awoke in the Hogwarts hospital wing. The madam of the wing, Pomfrey, they said her name was left a dinner tray loaded with beefy vegetable soup, a salad, and cornbread beside his bed. In any other situation, Tom would have glowered at the strange choice of food, but ever since his return to the living, his stomach was like a bottomless pit, and the soup was plenty tasty. He fast learned to tune out the madam as he stuffed his face. Pomfrey seemed endeared by his ability to eat so much food. After his first breakfast with her, she started bringing 3 or 4 backup trays of various dishes. Wards weren't offered 5-course meals in the Hogwarts hospital wing when he attended the school, and he was almost positive it wasn't normal for the other students trapped in sterile sheets. Of course, they were petrified and lacked the ability to eat anything at all, but that was beside the point. He suspected the older woman's behavior had something to do with the fact that she had diagnosed him with severe malnutrition and told him to eat all of the food she gave him. The combination of what he recognized as the joy of seeing somebody actually follow her instructions for once, and what he thought he recognized as the desire to find something he wouldn't eat sent the woman on a mission to feed him all manner of foods. A fruitless mission, as those who grew up hungry never developed picky eating habits. During lunch the day before, she outright asked him when the last time he ate was. Fortunately, she took his honest answer of 50 years as a joke. She came to clear the tray and dishes as soon as he finished. It was then that he felt a familiar rumbling in his stomach. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said to the woman as he squeezed past her and made his way to the lavatory on the other side of the room. The doors to the stalls had no locks, as the need to come in and resuscitate an unconscious child if the situation called for it outweighed the need for privacy. He didn't even bother closing the door as he knelt over the toilet bowl. Ever since the faculty half-carried him to the infirmary, he had difficulty keeping food down. He had no trouble getting it down, but keeping it there proved difficult. When he did manage to keep food down, it didn't stay inside of him for very long, but an antidiuretic potion resolved that issue. He didn't have the heart to tell the Medi, which said he had the stomach of a newborn, literally, and couldn't handle food heavier than breast milk without the normal bacterial flora people develop naturally. Truth be told, he just didn't fancy Hogwarts hiring a wet nurse or ordering baby formula for him, which would be the medically sound thing to do. Instead of suffering that indignity and slowly working his way up through Gerber peaches, crackers, soups, and breads, he skipped right to eating an adult diet. And he was paying the price for it. "Would you like mint or strawberry rinse today?" Pomfrey called into the bathroom as he spat the last chunks of food that caught in his gums on the way back out. "Spearmint, if you'd be so kind," he grumbled back as he wiped his mouth clean with a piece of tissue. He flushed the toilet, cleaning a few spots of vomit from the bowl with another loose piece of tissue, and walked over to the sink area. The Muggle brand of mouthwash waited for him like a gift from heaven, and he gargled the burning liquid with the appreciation of a drowning man finding land. He had to fight the urge to swallow and remove the taste of bile from his throat. That would not do his stomach any favors. He walked, not stumbled, back to his bed and felt a smidgen of pride slowly return at the small success. He could have laughed at how pathetic and weak he was from 3 days of quasi-nutrition and the lack of energy that came with it. He couldn't begin to imagine how screwed he would have been if he had to escape that chamber and sneak out of Hogwarts on his own. He would have starved to death after a few days on his own unless he were to break into some woman's house and steal baby food. Would he have resorted to that? He wasn't sure. Regardless, he would have gotten sick and died due to his lack of an immune system. That problem he did see fit to tell the Mediwitch about. His bum was all the sorer for it. The tale of inoculations he received were decidedly unpleasant, but at least he wasn't going to kill over the first time somebody sneezed on him. It was already nighttime, and he had already slept the whole day away. Again, realizing he wasn't going to get any more rest, he returned to his newfound hobby of staring at the ceiling. The clacking of hard-heeled boots coming towards his bed was his first sign of trouble. "Still moping? Are we, Tom?" He groaned at the sound of her voice as he wrapped the bleached linen back around himself. "Hello to you too, Minerva," Tom said to his former upperclassman. He turned to look at the woman. God, she gotten old. She went from being 2 years older than him to over 50 years older than him in the blink of an eye. From his perspective, at least. She still had that same bitchy expression permanently affixed to her face. The pursed lips and haughty attitude were kind of hot when she had smooth skin, a figure slimmer than a toothpick, and an impressive tan for a bookworm. As she was now, her skin pale and wrinkled with age, Her demeanor was simply punchable. She carried a large stack of books propped underneath her chin. Some things really don't change, do they? I figured 76 hours crying like a third-year girl after a silly breakup was enough. You're done feeling sorry for yourself. Minerva told him. It was not a question. It was a demand, a statement of a change in reality she was willing into existence. She dropped the stack of books onto his bed, and by extension him, sending them into a heap around his legs. He picked up the particularly large tome that landed between his legs and was surprised the thing didn't fall apart in his hands. It was ancient. Its edges were long since worn out, and its once perfectly white pages yellowed through. He was almost as shocked to recognize the title of the Transfiguration book, and the Charms book, and Defense books, and his other Charms book from year 4, and a Transfiguration book from year 1. You kept all of your old school books? Tom asked incredulously, glowering at the woman as she brushed herself off. Of course, she said with a shrug, as if it were a silly question, before folding her arms defensively. Didn't you? Riddle considered the woman for a moment before scrounging around the pile of textbooks. He picked up a 5th and 6th-year Charms book and opened them both to the glossary. You see here how in the first chapter of every edition, it gives a summary and refresher on every spell in the previous year's edition. He asked rhetorically, handing one of the books to her. Well, yes, but she sputtered as she gingerly took the book from him. And do you recall how every year Hogwarts gets a whole new batch of students, or returning students, in need of books? Some of whom can't afford their own? Continued Tom, interrupting her earlier retort. Yes, but I wait. She paused as she seemed to digest what he said. Are you saying you gave your old books away to younger students? Yup. You. Me. Every year. Every single one. That's very charitable of you. Yes. What of it? Her glowering transformed into a deep scowl of skepticism. However did she come to have such deep wrinkles? He wondered. I'm sorry, but I just can't picture you doing that, Tom. Minerva said. He could only blink at her. What? He demanded more than asked. Well, you were always kind of stingy. I would have expected you to throw them away before donating them to anybody. She said. The last vestiges of his normally cool demeanor vanished, as it always did when they argued. I wasn't stingy, you trust fund cocotte. I was bloody poor, Tom yelled. She sputtered for a moment, trying to decide if she was bothered by his profanity or the insult. She resorted to Old Faithful. Fuck you, she screamed. Fuck you, he screamed back, putting emphasis on the subject of the statement. And fuck you right back, you bloody dauber. She came back at him with her deepened Scottish accent. It always made a surprise appearance whenever they argued. She turned heel and stormed away. He couldn't even release the sigh of relief at her departure before she turned back on him, just shy of the hospital wing entrance. She had that look on her face. The look girls wear whenever they try to find a plot hole in a man's story. He tried practicing that expression in the bathroom mirror in his 5th year. Men must lack the facial muscles or bone structure. Wait just 1 minute. If you were so poor, why would you give the books away instead of selling them secondhand or pawning them? She asked. A WWW. How cute. She thought she caught him in a lie. She never learns. Because Minerva, he said in his best imitation of her matter-of-fact voice. I lack the ability to pay back my upperclassmen for giving them to me in the first place, so instead I paid it forward by giving my books away to newer students. Even I don't try to profit off of gifts from others. Usually. And there it was. Guilt. Plain as day on her face. People always thought he was a silver-tongued liar, a fact which he would never deny, but in most cases the truth, or a part of it, was a better weapon to stab at a person's heart or tool to convince them of your perspective. Oh, well, of course. Excuse me. She sputtered before turning to leave again. Minerva, he called before she vanished from sight. She whipped back around, no doubt expecting another bout of expletives. Thank you, he said in his most heartfelt and well-practiced tone. Her face softened for a fraction of a second before hardening again. He was sure if anybody else were watching they would have missed it. For the books, I mean, he clarified. She glared. Not just these ones. He continued, indicating the pile on his lap. The ones you gave me in my 4th year. If you'll recall, that's how we first met. Her brow furrowed as she examined him. He watched with amusement as recognition slowly dawned on her face, and she dug up those memories that to him were relatively fresh. Then she really did leave. The silence that followed brought him a deep sense of nostalgia. It was the same silence that always followed their fights back in the day. For a moment, it was as if he never left, and he could almost delude himself into thinking he hadn't, and that the former head girl had simply suffered an accident with an aging potion. I missed our little chats. He mumbled to himself with a chuckle. Minerva was right. He was tired of feeling sorry for himself and tired in general. Reviewing his old textbooks went a long way towards alleviating his boredom. During his stay there, the only interesting thing to happen was when the Medowitch and Potions Master, who looked an awful lot like that surly Eileen girl in the year above Minerva, came in on the second day to unpetrify the victims of the basilisk. He made a mental note to meet with the mute potions nerd and see how well she had aged compared to Minerva, and considered which other students from his time at Hogwarts would make an interesting case study in aging gracefully. He watched the Hogwarts staff begin the slow process of reviving his fellow guests with equal parts guilt and fascination. He didn't envy Pomfrey's job. Trying to coax a tube down the throat of a person turned to stone was difficult enough, but they had to do it to 4 students and a cat, which was probably easier done petrified than if the feline were awake. Correction, it was definitely easier if Harry's memories of how unpleasant Norris is could be believed. It was the ghost of Sir Nicholas de Mimsy that fascinated him. The charms professor, a part goblin called Flitwick who even he found cute and likable, used a combination of several spells to aerosolize the Mandrake draft without heating it, which probably would have ruined the potion. They were effectively giving Nick a cold steam bath. Flitwick did it all wordlessly, much to Tom's chagrin, so he'd have to wait to ask the diminutive man about it some other time. The entire hospital wing stank something fierce for the rest of the day. When he asked her, Pomfrey said it would be a couple more days before everyone woke up. He doubted something that interesting would happen again during his stay, so he took to reviewing the old texts from his first-year books through 4th. He wasn't allowed a wand to practice the material, but he could walk down memory lane and try to remember his fellow students during his time at Hogwarts and compare his own experiences with Harry's. Thus, he spent the whole evening properly parsing which memories were his and which were Harry's, with mixed success. He hadn't gotten very far in his self-taught occlumency, but he learned enough to organize his memories into a mental castle and created a separate one for Harry's. It was slow work, but as the day wore on, he regained some sense of self. The hospital wing was bathed in golden light from the rising sun when he decided to finish up for the night. That was when one of the other patients decided now was a good time to scare him out of his skin with a sudden high-pitched gasp. The girl in the bed next to him sat bolt upright in an instant. He dropped the history book he was preparing to bookmark when she did. The bushy-haired girl had that squinting glare, the one that every decidedly not a morning person has when they wake up. The slow breath she released as she surveyed her surroundings sounded like a hiss, and when roughly translated into parcel tongue, sounded like a groaned fuwuk, which seemed appropriate. He cowered behind his book as her gaze landed on him. Hoping the girl would go right back to sleep, he dared to peek over the top. She was now standing at his bedside, staring down at him with eyes so tightly squinted that for a moment he wondered if she was sleepwalking. That was until she broke out in a big, toothy grin. Emphasis on toothy. She really should get those incisors filed down. Maybe Tom could borrow one of those industrial grinders he'd used on his summer job down on the Muggle docks. He knew a guy down by the docks from when he worked under the table who had probably long since died from old age. Good to finally meet ya, she said, offering a hand, which he took while fighting to keep an expression of deep horror off of his face. I'm Hermione Granger. You look so much like your cousin. He stared back at her, still shaking her hand. She'd been looking forward to meeting him? Did she know he was Voldemort? Who the hell looked forward to meeting such a disgusting creature? Had she mistaken his identity? Did she know who he really was, but not that he'd one day become the Dark Lord? All of these thoughts and more would have been running through his head if the normally analytical voice in the front of his wasn't being overpowered by the panicking voice in the back of his head, a voice that was now screaming, "Oh shit! Oh shit! Oh shit!" at a deafening decibel. "Huh," he said with utmost eloquence. He moved his free hand to his ear as if he hadn't quite heard her. Hermione, like from the Odyssey, she unhelpfully explained. When Harry said you were bigger than him, I expected you to be rounder. Big-boned, if you will. Not taller and older. Does scrawniness run in both the Potter and Evans line alike? He continued to stare at her awkwardly as her questions got increasingly rude. With that last one, Tom realized who this girl thought he was. I'm not Dudley, he half yelled with incredulity. To her credit, she didn't even flinch at his venom. Impressive. That spoiled fat ass wouldn't fit through the doors of the Great Hall. Her smile widened as she let go of his hand. And by that I mean, who is Dudley? Does he strike an imposing figure? He tried to backtrack. She giggled, still showing off her massive teeth. He wondered if he should try extracting one of those to hit the diary with. Basilisk fangs be damned. Those chompers look like the bane of Horcruxes and dark beasts alike. Okay, I'm stumped. Who are you really? Hermione asked. Oh, doth his ears deceive him? Had the young lady asked him to lie? His specialty. He recovered his composure and worked to make his face placid, if a little smug. Time for the oldest technique in the book. Let them come up with your lie for you. Well, you've only made one guess. You get two more, little lady, he said as he flashed her the most minute hint of a smile. This one he saved for younger girls who tried to act older than they were and who were very bad at hiding their crush on him. Hermione just rolled her eyes, and he tried to dig through Harry's memories of her as she spoke. Really, he was just stalling her until he could come up with something believable. Let's see. You look like Harry. True enough. Kinda talk like Harry, at least when he's not being all shy. He had no objective frame of reference for that claim, but he believed it. You know his cousin. Shit. And you're what, 16? He waved his hand in a meh kind of motion. She rubbed her chin thoughtfully as she combined these disparate facts in her hunt for a conclusion. She also went back to squinting at him like a bug underneath a magnifying glass. Her scrutiny made him feel oddly naked, and he pulled his sheets tighter over himself as a result. You are, in fact, Harry Potter, she proclaimed as her grin returned. You brewed another batch of polyjuice potion without me and tried to infiltrate Slytherin as an older student, but you botched it. He stared at her. She stared back. He stared at her some more. She started to look less sure of herself. Wow, said Tom. It's all he could come up with. Yeah, she said nervously. That is one hell of a guess. He said, I take it you have some experience with polyjuice potions going wrong? By now, he'd already retrieved the more recent memories of the little girl from the back of his mind where he disposed of most of his new, ill-gotten knowledge. He already knew the answer. Yeah, bit. I take it that's a no. She said, deflating before his eyes. Decidedly so. Try again for a sickle. He offered with a sly grin. She scrunched up her face and readopted that inquisitive glare of hers. She stayed like that for 5 whole minutes. He counted. If he had that kind of concentration, he could have passed all of his newts as a 4th year. I give up. Who are you? She conceded rather quickly. He shook his head. Would you believe me if I said I'm a long-lost cousin on his father's side? Tom asked. Not a chance. She rejected. I'm his dad, but I've been frozen in an iceberg for 10 years and decided to get some nip and tuck before coming to see him. He tried. No, she deadpanned. I'm the shade of a 16-year-old Voldemort brought back to life through horrifically dark magi. This one he said with a ghostly, what tone? Come on, how gullible do I look? She asked askance. I'm Harry's time-traveling grandson from the future who came back in time because I'm in love with you. Nana? Course. Whether she was disgusted at the idea that she had married and had children with Harry or that a grandchild born from their union would come back in time to woo her, he couldn't tell. Probably the idea of being with a boy full stop, he decided. Tom shrugged with a fake sigh. Well, I don't know what to tell you, kiddo. The truth is I'm not allowed to share my identity with you. Headmaster's orders. He explained, hoping he could contact Dumbledore and ask him to cover up for his lie before the girl went asking him. She huffed and puffed her cheeks, now red with frustration. He could not believe Harry had such a hard time dealing with her tantrums. This girl was easier to pick on than Myrtle Warren. Well, I think you're a right, big jerk. If you don't tell me who you are, I'll... Hermione started. What she intended to do if he continued to keep a secret the world will never know, because he decided not to let her finish that threat. Madame Pomfrey. The vegetables are getting uppity, he yelled out, and the school nurse came running. Miss Granger, get back in bed this minute, roared Pomfrey as she stormed through the aisles of hospital beds. Hermione cowered as the rampaging witch approached, barely managing to fling the sheets back over herself before the terror was upon her. Madame Pomfrey sniffed at the recently revived girl and yanked the covers off of her. On second thought, get over to the showers. You've been petrified for 23 whole days, and you desperately need one. Your hair looks horrendous, Pomfrey ordered. Tom resisted the urge to inform Pomfrey that Hermione's hair always looked horrendous. Partly because he shouldn't know that information, and the bushy-haired girl was smart enough to recognize that he shouldn't know that information, but also because her hair did look even messier than normal, almost like she'd been electrocuted. Apparently, petrification does not turn a victim's hair to stone. I'll send for a change of clothes and a proper meal for you. You focus on getting yourself cleaned up, Pomfrey added as she chased the cowering child to the shower room. All she was missing was a cattle prod, Tom thought to himself as he rolled over and buried his face into the pillow. He slept like a baby that night. Want your story written? I take commissions now. You can pay me to write your fanfiction or original works. My prices are as follows. $25 per 1,000 words of fanfiction, with some wiggle room. I don't pad my work. You also get to video chat with me as I type the first chapter. $25 per 500 words for original works, so anything that is not fanfiction. I also charge $25 per 500 words for smut or fetish materials. Prices subject to change in the future. Check with me. Become a patron. NonsensicalRants. You can also still become a patron for $1 to get access to future chapters 2 weeks early and vote on which stories I update next. 3. Interhouse Cooperation. Chapter 3. Interhouse Cooperation. Ronald Weasley sat alone in the Gryffindor common room that night. The fire was little more than embers at this point, but he couldn't bring himself to break eye contact with the dying light source. It had been a whole day since Dumbledore summoned him, Fred, George, and Percy to his office where their parents sat waiting for them. They expected the headmaster to explain the condition of Harry and their sister, who they at that point assumed had been ushered to the now barricaded hospital wing. They had not expected to spend the rest of that day helplessly watching their mother weep. Ron still couldn't manage a tear of his own. He tried to force it, as if it was his duty to show some outward sign of his inner suffering, but he just didn't have it in him. Maybe it was that whole denial step of dealing with death that people talked about. Maybe he'd already counted her as dead after the blood on the wall said as much, or maybe he'd come to accept it in his days of waiting. Harry's death, on the other hand, he simply didn't believe. His best friend was invincible. Full stop. He couldn't have died. Ron was proof positive that the boy who lived could swan dive into the mouth of an active volcano with a barrel of exploding ginger eyelashes strapped to his back, and he'd crawl out of the crater with nothing to show for it but singed robes. What hope did some legless lizard, no matter how magical, have against the force of nature that was Harry Potter? Ron could more easily stop a hurricane by spitting at it. It was ridiculous. It was asinine. The fact that Dumbledore thought so low of Ron's intelligence that he thought he'd believe such a lie was insulting. He almost jumped when Fred and George crashed into the cushions on either side of him with identical size, very rudely breaking him from his thoughts. They sank into a deep slouch as they joined him in gazing at the embers. They sat in silence for some time, undoubtedly looking the pinnacle of despondency to an outside observer. "So, you guys aren't going to try and cheer me up?" he asked his brothers when the silence dragged on too long. Fred grunted. George chuckled. "Even we can recognize a lost cause when we see one," said Fred. "We just wanted to see if your coping method was better than ours," said George. "I gotta tell ya, this isn't doing much for me." Ron grimaced and grabbed the bucket of sand from the edge of the hearth. He threw it, pail and all, into the firebox, extinguishing what was left of the once roaring flames. With that chore done, he stood up and stretched the kinks out of his back, looking from Fred to George. "And what was your coping method?" Ron dared to ask. The two proceeded to have a full-length Aristotelian debate with nothing more than eyebrow movements, hand-waving, and shrugs. Fred launched the discussion with a toothy wince and raised shoulder. George countered with a thumb to Ron and a wave of his hand in a get-it-over-with motion. Fred responded with a two-handed movement indicating himself and George, and then waving one hand over his head indicating the ceiling or castle at large. Eventually, Fred relented to a particularly persuasive eyebrow wiggle and nod towards Ron from George and produced a square piece of parchment before unfolding it. It was blank, marked with more wrinkles than a retired scarlet woman and bore stains of what he hoped was coffee. Ron took it, struggling to hold the wall chart-sized piece of paper. The thing was nearly as big as he was. He turned it over, examined the back, turned it over again to examine the front, and turned his gaze to his brothers with a suspicious glare. They answered his unspoken question by simultaneously tapping the parchment with their wands and speaking in stereo. "I solemnly swear that I am up to no good." Lines of ink spread across the surface of the paper like impossibly thin roots of a plant. They grew over each other in checkered patterns, merged into larger lines, and framed the edges and corners of the parchment with swirling patterns. Green letters, written in impressively beautiful calligraphy, grew from the black ink and proclaimed, "Messrs. Mooney, Wormtail, Padfoot, and Prongs, purveyors of aids to magical mischief makers, are proud to present the Marauder's Map. We've been looking for the entrance to the Chamber of Secrets," explained Fred as Ron examined the details of the table-sized parchment. He found the Gryffindor common room with ease, where he spotted 3 dots indicating the 3 Weasleys. Their names hovered over the dots exclaiming who they were. The dormitories were not shown, which made sense considering it was 7 rooms spread over 7 identical floors magically occupying the same 10-meter by 10-meter space. However, the entrance to the common room showed a list of everybody occupying them in random order. Names of young students like Longbottom. Neville sat beside names of older students he knew like Woods, Oliver, and older students he didn't know like Pettigrew Peter. He felt guilty at the epiphany of realizing he didn't know the names of any of his upperclassmen that weren't related to him or on the Quidditch team. He considered vowing to remedy that issue but discarded the vow almost immediately. He'd never actually go through with it. Too much work. The girls' dormitory was also hidden and near the entrance 30. 3 names were listed compared to the 30 for the boys' dormitory. Both were shy of the normal 35, and Ron counted 3 of the missing boys currently loitering next to the fireplace. He stared in confusion as he tried to figure out who else was missing before remembering Percy went on prefect patrol an hour earlier and noticing that the name Potter, Harry, was missing from the list, and hoping in vain to find Harry or Ginny sneaking somewhere around the castle grounds. Added George after the few minutes of silence. Ron nodded and searched the entirety of the map for the hospital wing when his heart leapt. "Hermione and the others are moving," he said, placing the map on the floor so Fred and George could see it for themselves. Sure enough, Hermione was up and about in the hospital wing. She wasn't the only one. Justin, Colin, and Penelope were all with her huddling near the center of the ward, along with a 4th person. "Whoa, the map's never done that before," commented Fred. The name for this mysterious 5th person was illegible, not due to any smudging or poor penmanship, but because it kept changing. Before Ron's very eyes, it went from Gar Marmelo Rester to Hamra Mommelpisley to Terravry Jolo Weedle. Madame Pomfrey was notably missing from the hospital wing, but Nicholas de Mimsy Porpington was just outside of it in the hallway. "A mystery for later, I suppose," George said in defeat. Then something else happened. The dot labeled Finch Fletchley, Justin, seemingly flew across the room towards the entrance of the ward, stopping just shy of the hallway beyond. The dot labeled Clearwater, Penelope, followed suit as Justin walked back around to join the other dots on the map. It wasn't uncommon for objects to mysteriously fly across rooms, but Peeves was several floors down and on the other side of the castle if the map was to be believed. Then Hermione followed Penelope's example. "What are they doing?" Ron asked. The bushy-haired girl roared with laughter as she slid across the magically slicked floor, taking care to keep her arms wrapped around her knees and her skirt in place. The girl clearly learned a lesson from Penelope failing to keep prudence in mind when she made the dive. "Congrats, guys," said Penelope as Hermione brushed herself off. "You've mastered the Glissio charm." Tom nodded in encouragement as he kneeled down and rubbed the slick floor. Not a single bump or rough spot to be found. Couldn't have done it better myself. He lied. Colin, a minuscule boy with mousy hair, beamed at him as he stood up. You wizards sure do suffer from a lack of water slides in your world, he said with a toothy, though not quite Granger-toothy grin. Both Justin and Hermione laughed, but seemed to agree. Tom had never heard of a water slide, but he could guess what it was. Well, I hate to break it to you, Creevy, but you're a wizard too. But I'd say this is a decent replacement, am I right? Said Justin. The other three nodded, and Tom, deciding to act like he knew what they were talking about, nodded as well. Next summer, let's go ahead and try to transfigure one of those giant water slides next to the lake, like the ones Americans have, said Penelope, who Tom was fast starting to like. Oh, that would be great. Maybe we can pool our money to buy one of those floating bouncy castle blocks for the lake too, said Hermione, who he was fast starting to dislike. What in the blazes was a floating bouncy castle block? Oh, I visited my cousin in the States once, and we went to a water park with one of those. Justin explained. I think they just call them inflatable blobs. You jump onto it on one end from a platform, and it flings whoever's on the other end into the air. So much fun. Tom tried to ignore his developing headache and keep a friendly exterior, but he was failing. You guys, we didn't teach you this spell just for fun. It could really save your life, Tom half chastised. It's true, said Penelope. They really should start teaching it to first years. Imagine if you'd known this spell when you fought off that troll last year. And Hermione? Troll? Hermione had fought a troll? Tom didn't recall that. You'd think that would stand out in the jumbled mess that was his mind. But a Glissio charm definitely would have made short work of a troll. They have neither good balance nor good observational skills. Yeah, it's ridiculous. Justin added, you never start a sorcerer in D&D without the grease spell. This should be taught in the first lesson. This comment got him strange, almost disgusted looks from his fellow Muggleborns. Tom decided not to ask what D&D stood for. By the time they teach it to fifth years, you get nothing but immature laughter. Penelope went on. By then they can all only come up with naughty uses for it. Really, said Colin, because I'm coming up with plenty of naughty uses for it myself. Penelope did a poor job of hiding her shock at hearing those words from an 11-year-old boy. Tom hoped he had a better poker face. He made a mental note to visit the boys' home unannounced at the first opportunity. Something untoward must be going on there, and he'd have to put a stop to it, just like he'd done with Dennis and Amy's mother in that cave. I'll have to show this to the Weasley twins, Colin added before mumbling to himself about a scheme involving somebody named Snape, a cauldron of chicken grease, and a sack of itching powder. Ah, innocence. Tom scratched off subjecting Mr. and Mrs. Creevy to a fate worse than death off of his mental to-do list. It was for the best. He doubted he could outdo his work on Amelia Benson née Bishop. Children, they all whipped around to see nearly headless Nick's flopping head peering through the floor. Madame Pomfrey is coming. Back into your beds. Hurry! They thanked their partner in crime and all rushed back to their own beds, flinging the sheets over themselves. His fellow inmates were a little too enthusiastic in their attempts to mimic deep and even breathing. They were terrible at pretending to be asleep. Madame Pomfrey strolled into the hospital wing moments later. She carried a pile of clean linen high enough to hide her head. She lightly placed the top section of the stack on the railing at the foot of Creevy's bed, doing her best not to wake him up, and walked across to where Penelope slept. A split second later, the Mediwitch landed on her back with a sickening thud as the sheets and blankets she carried flew in every direction as if scattered by a gust of wind. Everyone made a show of waking up at the noise, a much more impressive display of acting skill than their fake sleep, and Tom spied Hermione surreptitiously cast the counter for the Glissio spell from the bed beside him. He couldn't hear her incantation, but he did pick up the very grown-up swearing she whispered under her breath at how stupid it was to leave the spell active. "Madam, are you okay?" A tall, red-haired boy, Percy, Tom recalled, said in concern as he ran in and tried to help her to her feet. Pomfrey refused his hand, opting to rise on her own. Her movements were delicate and slow. Tom noted the hand she used to check her waist as she stood and realized broken hips were probably a sensible concern for a woman her age. Not that she looked particularly old. Not at all. Madam, you are overworked, said Sir Nicholas as he floated up to her. Perhaps you should hand over your duties to Mr. Weasley a bit early and call it an evening? Percy, to his credit, didn't comment on the ghost's suggestion, but did do his usual display of preening by standing up straighter. Tom spotted the red tinge to his ears, and so did his girlfriend if her knowing smile was any indication. Pomfrey didn't say anything, staring off into space. After a moment, she waved for Percy to take over and left the hospital wing with a knight as her escort. She deserved it. They all said goodbye to Pomfrey and Sir Nicholas, and with them their chance at an evening of fun. With the return of adult supervision, they all got back into their beds, and this time genuinely tried to go back to sleep instead of pretending. This proved difficult for Tom. The excitement of Glissio, sliding with his new not-quite friends, would take a while to wear off, and Tom usually had enough difficulty winding down on excitement-free evenings. He considered the idea of summoning a house elf to bring him some hot apple cider, a drink which never failed to put him right to sleep, but discarded the idea. For one thing, he didn't know the names of any current house elves in Hogwarts, and for another, he didn't want the youngsters around him to discover that they could lazily summon house elves anytime they wished. It wasn't good for your work ethic. It was dreadful for your waistline. He was on the cusp of blissful sleep when a thundering crash echoed from the hallway outside of the hospital wing. Tom sat bolt upright in his bed, just in time to see Percy drop the book he was reading and sprint out of the room to investigate. That guy sure could move when he felt like it. Silence rang after the door slammed shut behind the prefect. Looking at the other prisoners told Tom that he was the only person having difficulty falling asleep. Why was that? Colin grumbled at a whisper. Before they could wager a guess, the lavatory door opened, and out stepped their answer. Fred, Hermione half asked and half accused. He shushed her before sneaking across to the door his older brother had just slammed shut. He cracked it open and peered outside. It's George, actually, he said, still whispering as he gently closed the door, holding the handle down to make sure it closed silently. Now come on, you're all going to want to be a part of this. He walked back over to the lavatory and removed his shoe, which he used to prop it open. He hobbled his way over to Hermione's bed and conjured a Granger-sized pillow. He unceremoniously shoved the girl out of the bed and tucked the pillow in like his own child. Her replacement was convincing enough. Hermione tried to object, but George shoved her along towards the lavatory. The rest of them didn't bother trying to resist. And to be fair, Tom was sure none of them would choose an evening in the hospital wing over an adventure with the living bludgers anyways. Penelope even helped to conjure pillows for stuffing the sheets before joining them at the door. I'm staying, she said as George slipped his shoe back on. But you guys have fun. Trust me, Penny, said George. You don't want to miss out on this. She looked at him smugly. As if I'd rather miss out on the chance to spend a few hours alone with my boyfriend in a room full of comfy beds? Not likely. Now, get going before I decide to act like a proper prefect. She turned on Tom, pointing what she must have thought was an authoritative finger at him. You be sure to give me all of the details later. All right, you got it, said Tom. I suppose we couldn't have picked a better person for distraction duty. Later, with that the sole Ravenclaw of their group closed the door behind them and they were down to 1 Slytherin, 1 Hufflepuff, and 3 Gryffindors. Tom didn't appreciate the demographic shift. All right, come on. Quickly, whispered George as he led them down the rows of toilets and shower stalls. He stopped near the very back of the tiled room and wiggled his way into a gap between 2 showers. Tom heard the telltale tapping of a wand against stone before the redhead whispered the password to what would no doubt become Tom's favorite secret passage in the coming days. They cured my Scrivener's palsy. I need to go catch it again, George said. The redhead squeezed back out as the grinding sound of the opening passage echoed throughout the room. All right, mystery man, you first, said George, motioning for Tom to squeeze into the dark cavity. Tom looked over both of his shoulders, as if expecting to find a previously unseen man standing behind him. Apparently, George was referring to him. We need somebody at the bottom to catch these midgets if they slip and fall, said George, indicating their smaller companions with a thumb. You're the biggest person here. Tom shrugged in agreement at this reasoning and pushed through. The secret passage was barely more than a manhole, with what looked like a fire escape ladder. George's concerns were valid. The bars were as slick as you'd expect a fire escape ladder beside a communal shower room to be. He almost slipped and fell 4 times himself. The ladder was 3 stories high and spat him out into a first-floor corridor, the one opposite the first floor of the hospital tower. He was greeted by George's other half and the last person he wanted to see. "Who are you?" Ron asked rather rudely. Tom shook his head. "Can't say. Headmaster's orders," he told Ron before turning back to yell up the ladder. "I'm down, send the next person. But be careful, the bars are slippery." Hermione came next, and upon reaching the bottom, she immediately embraced Ron in what he could tell was a bone-crushing hug. The only kind of hug she ever gave. Not that Tom had ever personally experienced one. "It's so good to see you, Ron. It's dreadful that they aren't allowing visitors," Hermione said as she broke the embrace. "It's fine. Who's your new friend?" he asked, pointing at Tom. "Can't say. Headmaster's orders," she repeated Tom's lie, turning away from her friend to slyly wink at Tom. And like that, his fondness for the beaver started to grow back. Colin almost made it all the way down, but slipped at the last 8-foot stretch of ladder, falling safely into Tom and Fred's waiting arms. Justin and George joined them soon after. Each was greeted by a duet of hugs, and when they all arrived, his 6 companions wore nothing but smiles. "That's everyone. Penny decided to stay back and distract Perk," said George. "Right then? You want to tell them? Or should we?" said Fred, clasping Ron on the shoulder. The youngest Weasley glanced between his 2 brothers pleadingly. They gave him no quarter, and he audibly swallowed before sticking his chin up and practically glowing with Gryffindor courage. "Dumbledore says Harry and Ginny are dead," Ron told them. Hermione, Colin, and Justin all visibly paled as their smiles melted away. Tom noticed George strategically positioning himself to catch them if the news turned out to be too much to grasp. Tom mirrored the sentiment and stood behind Justin, who was the first to recover. "You snuck us out of the hospital wing to tell us that," he said venomously. "No wonder they won't let you guys visit. I really didn't need to hear that while my joints are still part stone." Tom flinched at the idea of how painful walking must be for them all. This entire ordeal was fast becoming nothing more than a guilt fest for him. Leave it to Hermione to improve the mood. "You don't believe him," Hermione said in an impressively serious voice. Ron locked eyes with her and nodded, just as seriously. "The old man refused to answer any of our questions," said Fred. "Everything we know, we learned from Ron," said George. They all turned their attention back to the smallest ball of freckles, who gulped again. "The heir of Slytherin kidnapped Ginny. Harry and I tracked down the entrance to the chamber and went after her," Ron explained, speaking at speeds that outstripped Hermione's usual breathless tirades. "We also kidnapped Professor Lockhart, who turned out to be a fraud and almost got us killed when he tried to obliviate us and caused a cave-in. We all survived, but Harry and I were separated," he went on, "and I went back to get help. That's all I know." They all took a moment to digest that. "Let me guess," said Tom, breaking the silence. "You're going to do what all students do when the adults refuse to give us answers. You want to go find out the truth for yourself." Fred and George both beamed at him. Sometimes it really was that easy to earn somebody's friendship. "Exactly," said Ron. "And we figured," started Fred, "if we're going to enter a basilisk lair," continued George, "we ought to bring along the champs who beat it in a staring contest," finished Ron, grinning widely at the success at completing the twins' line of thought. Justin barked out a laugh, but it held no humor. "I wouldn't say we came out on top in those contests," he complained. "Ah, right. Hufflepuff. Cowards. The lot of them. And I don't fancy a rematch," added the youngest Gryffindor, timidly. "For shame, Colin. It's not about revenge," said Hermione, turning her hissing voice between Colin and Justin. "It's about doing the right thing and helping our friends." The girl was either secretly a master manipulator or had the uncanny ability to luck her way into saying the right thing. Both of the boys stood up straighter, Colin at the mention of doing the right thing and Justin at the word friend. "So, what's the plan?" asked Tom. "Simple," answered Fred. "We're kicking down the door to the Chamber of Secrets and turning the place upside down until we find our answers," explained George. "Want your story written?" I take commissions now. You can pay me to write your fanfiction or original works. My prices are as follows. $25 per 1,000 words of fanfiction, with some wiggle room. I don't pad my work. You also get to video chat with me as I type the first chapter. $25 per 500 words for original works, so anything that is not fanfiction. I also charge $25 per 500 words for smut or fetish materials. Prices subject to change in the future. Check with me. Become a patron. NonsensicalRants. You can also still become a patron for $1 to get access to future chapters 2 weeks early and vote on which stories I update next. 4. Scene of the Crime Part 1. Chapter 4. Scene of the Crime Part 1. When you said we were going into the Chamber of Secrets, I assumed you actually knew how to enter it. Hermione told Ron. Tom glowered at Hermione before she even finished the condescending observation. The Weasley trio lead them all the way to the second-floor bathroom, thankfully ghost-free at the moment. Along the way, they made 3 wrong turns, barely avoided a conflict with Peeves, and snatched Colin out of the air just before he fell into the trick step near the astronomy tower corridor. Ron then proceeded to paint the familiar sink with saliva for nearly 5 minutes as he tried his hand at Parseltongue. Don't listen to her, Ron. We have faith in you, Colin assured him. The others had been incredibly patient with his attempts at opening the chamber. He felt foolish just watching the boy, and Tom knew he would be embarrassed enough without being told off. Everyone save for Hermione did their best to keep him motivated. Maybe you should try inhaling as you hiss, suggested Justin. No, that's ridiculous, spat Hermione. Snakes hiss by forcibly expelling air from their glottis. Their what? Said Tom, before the others could express the same sentiment. Their glottis, she explained. The opening behind their tongues that they use to breathe. Don't you ever read? And thus, it came to pass that the heir of Slytherin received a lesson in snake anatomy from a Gryffindor mudblood. This day was just full of surprises. Maybe that's the secret, Colin suggested. Maybe you need to use your tongue more. Tom shared a knowing look with Fred and George at the unintentional innuendo before Justin went on. It's called parcel-tongue after all, the Hufflepuff added. Ron took this suggestion in stride and came surprisingly close to saying open in snake speak. Tom didn't bother hiding his surprise and allowed his eyebrows to reach his hairline. Fred and George, clearly unable to recognize the improvement, ushered the others to a counter on the opposite side of the bathroom. They produced a large square of parchment they unfolded to reveal a map with a large, ornate title at the top center, declaring it the Marauders Map, with the names of its 4 creators below it. It wasn't immediately clear what the map was of, and so Tom let his eyes drift to where he noticed some dots moving along the parchment. Clutter is no good for planning. Tom looked up to see Fred had pointed his wand at the map as he said the phrase, and when Tom looked back at it, all of the moving dots and labels were gone. This is the Marauders Map, explained George. It shows all of Hogwarts and its inhabitants, as well as most of the secret passages. Fred directed their attention to a room on the second floor. It doesn't show any in the second-floor bathroom, so clearly the Marauders didn't know about this one. He touched the map where Ron and the non-compliant sink would have been. It was a rather impressive map. You said it showed the inhabitants of Hogwarts too, but we're not showing up, Justin pointed out. Well, that's what the password about clutter was all about. Fred explained. It hides all of the names and room labels. George gave Tom a not-so-sly wink. Shit, they knew his name. At least they're keeping it secret from the youngins. He'd have to add that to the growing list of things to pass on to Dumbledore. He really needed the old man to cover up for him now. Okay, but why are you showing this to us? Colin asked. The twins shrugged in unison. Figured we'd find it more interesting than watching your brother do his best cat impression, said Tom. Hey, came the easily predicted indignation from the sink. You focus on opening the passage, Ronnikins. Fred yelled back. We'll handle the entertainment. Fred and George went on to explain some of the places the map didn't show, like the common rooms of each house and the bottom of the lake. Tom asked if the room of requirement showed up and received a series of blank stares. I'll show you guys where that one is after we're done here. Tom offered. It's damn cool. Before the others could ask for details about the room, Hermione made an offhand inquiry of her own. Can't we teach the map new secret passages? She asked. As soon as the words left her mouth, the map faded to white. Even the normal yellowing of age vanished, making room for a new message to appear. You found a new secret passage? As the large green letters faded, in turn a series of 4 beautifully inked drawings appeared on each corner of the parchment. Each moved in a loop similar to a wizarding photo. The first was a sleeping rat whose chest heaved with each Z that floated from its gaping mouth. The second was a dog scratching its ear. The dark flecks coming off of him with each scratch could only be fleas. The third was a noble stag standing at attention, not moving at all. The fourth was simply a moon with clouds passing over it. More lettering appeared, with a line indicating that it was the stag speaking. Touch the map with your wand at the location of the new secret passage and say "Mischief discovered." The images faded and the map reappeared. George followed the instructions. Upon tapping the second-floor bathroom and uttering the incantation, the rest of the map faded again as the depiction for the bathroom enlarged to fill most of the parchment. The 4 images reappeared on the corners, but this time they were much more attentive. The rat, Wormtail, stood on its hind legs, wringing its hands like a miserly merchant. The dog, Padfoot, sat at attention with its tongue lolling, and the stag, who they could deduce was Prongs by process of elimination, was now laying down like a relaxed lion. Mooney showed no changes, but honestly, how would you go about making a moon expressive? More instructions appeared near Prongs. Tap the exact location of the passage entrance and utter the phrase, "Here be magical mischief makers in need of aid." Fred did so, and 3 long horizontal lines appeared near the broken sink stall on the map. Leads to instructions, miscellaneous. Despite being self-explanatory, Prongs saw fit to give instructions on what to do. Do not write on the map. Tap the line in question and speak. I will take dictation. In the first line, state the name of the room the secret passage leads to. In the second, give step-by-step instructions on opening it. Be certain to say which step number it is before giving instructions. Say the word 1 for the first step, 2 for the second, and so forth. In miscellaneous, warn about any dangers beyond the passage, any unique requirements such as time of day, special details about the entrance to help people find it, or instructions on opening the passage from the other side if different from above. If Tom wasn't impressed with the map before, he certainly was now. The twins didn't waste any time. "The Chamber of Secrets," said George, touching the first line with his wand. 1. Say the word "open" in parcel tongue, said Fred, tapping the next line. "Must be able to speak parcel tongue," said Hermione, tapping the third line. "Beware of basilisks." The Weasley twins nodded in approval as she finished. Their words appeared on the lines in black ink as they said them. The lines faded, along with the instructions, and a new line of green text appeared below their instructions. "Is that all? Should we add anything else?" Fred asked George. "There's a snake engraved on the faucet." Ron yelled back. They added that, along with the detail that the sink doesn't work to help the particularly mentally impaired find it. Just in case, as the map returned to normal, their changes finalized. Ron seemed to lose his patience. "Open! Damn you!" Tom figured that would be the end of their little excursion for the evening and got up, expecting the others to follow him back to the hospital wing. Imagine his shock when he turned around to see the sink obeying Ron's order and fall into the floor amidst uproarious applause from the others. Ronald Weasley just learned to speak parcel tongue. That was supposed to be impossible. Many Parselmouths in history have tried to teach it and only ever succeeded in teaching people to understand it, not speak it. He wasn't sure which revelation was more surprising to him, that Ron had done the impossible, or that he'd mistaken Parseltongue for English for the first time in years. While he was lost in his thoughts, the bore down onto Ron. "Our Whittle Wanikin is a Parselmouth." Fred cheered, rustling Ron's hair and ignoring his younger brother's objections. "We better watch out. The world isn't ready for a dark lord of the Weasley line," George added. Tom could only stare as the others awarded Ron a well-deserved series of punches to the arm in congratulations. "But how?" Hermione finally broached. That put a quick end to the fanfare. The others took up Tom's strategy of staring at one another in silence. Maybe the Weasleys actually are descended from Slytherin and just didn't know it? Colin suggested. "We are pure blood," Fred said, nodding. We don't advertise it, but we are. And all pureblood families have mixed somewhere along the line. George added, nodding in turn. So maybe it's a recessive gene that just rarely expresses itself? Hermione rationalized. Tom shook his head. But even if that's true, there would be so many more parcel mouse crawling out of the woodwork. Hermione shrugged in response. Not really. How often do people encounter snakes here in the Northern Isle? Not often since St. Patrick got rid of them all. Just said. The ear-to-ear grin Justin showed off as he made the joke went a long way to lightening the mood. That didn't stop Ron from trying to drag it back down. But Harry could understand and speak to snakes without any training at all, said the smallest redhead. Hell, he couldn't even tell it apart from English. And some people are a natural on the broom, while others have to practice. Hermione said with crossed arms. It was her I win pose. So yeah, there probably are tons more parcel mouse around, they just never figure it out. If that's true, then how many more metamorphmagi are out there and don't know it? Or celerimagi? Asked Tom. Celery magi? Colin asked. The boy sure knew his phonics. Wizards who can move really fast. Tom explained with a dismissive wave. It's actually much more impressive than it sounds. I think Flitwick is one. This is all really fascinating, but don't we have a job to do? Ron prompted. They all turned to stare at the gaping hole Ron had opened up. It slowly dawned on them that their entire conversation up to that point was them stalling the inevitable plunge. Tom caught George looking at him expectantly and decided to sever that idea at the bud. Oh no. No. I am not going first. He refused. I don't even have a wand. Doesn't matter. Fred countered. Against a basilisk, we might as well all be going in wandless. Yeah, and you're the new guy, said Justin. We gotta see what you're made of. It's hazing time. Thankfully, Ron came to his rescue before his peers could. You guys, it's fine. I'll go, he said, and before anybody could object, he leapt into the entrance and vanished into the great pipe. The others went silent again as they stared at the spot where he vanished. Tom knew they wouldn't get a move on without some incentive. With a shrug, he bent down and hooked each arm around his smallest companion's chests. With his right, he lifted Colin with ease. Hermione was a bit heavier than he expected, but neither managed to squirm out of his grasp before he made the leap into the gaping hole as well, dragging them with him. Want your story written? I take commissions now. You can pay me to write your fanfiction or original works. My prices are as follows. $25 per 1,000 words of fanfiction, with some wiggle room. I don't pad my work. You also get to video chat with me as I type the first chapter. $25 per 500 words for original works, so anything that is not fanfiction. I also charge $25 per 500 words for smut or fetish materials. Prices subject to change in the future. Check with me. Become a patron. NonsensicalRants. You can also still become a patron for $1 to get access to future chapters 2 weeks early and vote on which stories I update. Next, 5. Scene of the Crime Part 2. Chapter 5. Scene of the Crime Part 2. Canterbury, England, 1938. Tom Riddle sat on a salt-eroded bench tossing pebbles over the cliff's edge. Watching them plummet into the raging ocean below served as a calming exercise for him. Their yearly field trip to Canterbury had finally lost all luster after 5 years of repeatedly exploring the same cathedrals, museums, and overpriced shops that none of his foster siblings could hope to afford sweets from, let alone Tom himself. Even the enthusiasm of the newly minted 6-year-olds going on their first ever outing couldn't break Tom out of his malaise. That being said, he had yet to tire of the majesty of nature on display here at the White Cliffs. They always spent their final day of the anonymous donor-funded trip walking the trail, overlooking an endless blue horizon. This year the wind was calm, and finally being 11 years old, he was granted the privilege to walk unsupervised. Unfortunately, the cost of this privilege was fast becoming too steep. I'm cold. Can we go back now? Tom turned to look at Amy and Dennis. Both were mere months younger than him, but due to happenstance of birth date, he was the one tasked with babysitting them. It's August and the breeze is lovely. How can you be cold? Amy retorted on Tom's behalf, earning her a rare and genuine smile of gratitude from the older boy. Indeed, it was after a 2-hour hike along the grassy trail. He had worked up a sweat, and the breeze was doing wonders to cool him off. Dennis didn't need a rest break. He clearly had energy to spare, and his excuse of being cold was an obvious attempt at goading Tom into continuing their jaunt, if only by sheer annoyance. He wasn't going to fall for it. If you want to warm yourself up, you could always just do jumping jacks. Tom supplied with a less sincere smirk than before. Yeah, get you all brawny and handsome for when you're old enough to ship off to Germany and kill socialists. Amy jeered. Dennis grinned a bit at Amy's chide. The mousy blonde went from giddy and twitchy to nervous and fumbling in the blink of an eye. I don't think the war will still be going on in another 8 years. It can't be, Dennis offered hopefully. The younger boy's downcast gaze and fidgeting fingers told Tom that he very much believed in the possibility of reaching adulthood to enter a world still at war. It was a vision of the future Tom shared in his heart of hearts, but one that he would not allow to ruin this otherwise perfect day for them. Could be, Tom admitted honestly, but I don't think you have to worry about recruiters knocking down your door. Dennis took a moment to catch his meaning, but perked up when he did. What are you trying to say? That I'm not fit enough to be a soldier? Amy stepped up to the plate, as she was wont to do every spare afternoon in the back alley sandlot beside Wool's orphanage, and took over teasing their especially scrawny friend. Please, Mr. Butthamiljagisoheavy, how are you going to carry a rifle or drag around munitions? It's munitions, you dork, Dennis objected. And who's to say I plan to enlist in a combat role? Maybe I'd be a medic, right? You a medic. You went crying to Tom when I cut myself on the fence sheet. How are you going to help with gunshot wounds when you can't bear the sight of blood? Tom remembered that incident. The back fence of the orphanage opened to a back alley the older orphans had converted to their best approximation of a sandlot. Being such cheapskates, the administrators saw fit to cover the gap with flimsy sheet metal instead of repairing it, and Amy sliced the back of her hand from finger to wrist on it. He had almost freaked out as badly as Dennis at the sight of her injury. It was only with practiced nonchalance that he had kept his cool, that and Amy's odd obliviousness to the injury. Hey! The adults freaked out even harder when they saw it. I'd say I handled that pretty well. Imagine how much better I'll be when I'm bigger. Dennis countered. That was fair. You'll be an even bigger baby. That are working at the home with those other bullies. Amy accused. That was decidedly unfair. Nah, if any of us were to wind up working there, it'd be you. Before Tom knew what was happening, Dennis gave Amy a solid push. It wasn't hard enough to push her over, but that didn't change the fact that they were standing near the edge of a cliff with a sheer drop to a craggy ocean shore. Tom wasn't a cook, but if we were to write a recipe book, this situation would be a decent ingredients reference for a good OL disaster. No, you, Amy roared as she shoved Dennis back. Tom only now recovered from the sudden terror that gripped him when Dennis gave the first shove. He shook off the freezing panic and rose to his feet, a dressing down on the tip of his tongue. He was too late. Amy slipped on the loose sand as she pushed back and slid 2 whole meters to the cliff edge. Dennis, in a moment of stunning bravery, leapt forward to grab her, landing prone on his stomach and grasping her wrists as she slid over the edge. Little Dennis had neither the strength to lift her up nor the weight to keep her anchored from going over. Thus he began sliding over with her. Tom, feeling like the last monkey in a barrel forming this chain, tried to grab hold of Dennis' ankles as the pair went over the edge and, missing, leapt over with them in his own stupidly brave attempt at a rescue. On the bright side, he did manage to grab both of them now that they were falling. They were screaming now, all 3 of them, and for once Tom felt not a shred of shame at letting his fear and panic show. None of them could rationalize what happened next, despite their most creative efforts. Soon they felt the air close in on them, squeezing them like a giant human hand made of rubber, and the next thing they knew, they had landed on a rock outcropping below. Unharmed, the present, Granger scampered away on all 4s, crushing the tiny pieces of fish and rodent bones and flinging them every which way in her rush. Oh, get over it. You're 12, Tom yelled at the suddenly indignant bookworm. She was having none of it. You grabbed my chest, Hermione complained again. It was taking all of his self-control not to give her a good smack to the back of her head. And I grabbed Collins, and yet I don't hear him crying about it. Tom told the girl. She had an impressive scowl. He's a boy, she hissed. For his part, the camera-wed Gryffindor was showing a great deal of intelligence and backing away from the irate beaver. "And in regard to your chest, so are you," Tom said with his most demeaning smile. Her horrified gasp at the insult was overshadowed by the twins crashing into the pool of bones as a pile of tangled limbs. It was a position Tom assumed they found themselves in regularly, if their practiced and organized procedure for untangling themselves was an indication. "Fred! George!" The pair of redheads looked up from their creative rendition of head, shoulders, knees, and toes, and turned serious in an instant at the sight of Hermione in a full-blown panic. "He groped me." They looked from the accusing finger to Tom and burst into simultaneous laughter. Tom scoured the memories he'd inherited from Harry, but even he had never seen the bookworm pout so adorably. "Well, Fred, I say we know our mystery man's preference," said George. "Quite. Clearly he is a fan of the breast," said Fred. "A boob man, through and through," they chorused. In all honesty, Tom wasn't what the twins called a boob man. Sure, he'd fondled a nice pair of mammaries or two during his school career, but he had other preferences in women. After all, Minerva had always been rather thin and flat, but oh boy, did she look good in that lingerie he bought her. Frilly stockings and silk pantaloons with the highest of heels to make her entire lower half look even tighter. His memory of that first time she'd given him a show was the first thing to successfully power his Patronus. Later, on the day of her graduation, he gained an even happier memory to use from her. Sadly, he couldn't use either of those memories anymore. They were tainted by the image of what Minnie looked like now. And wasn't that nightmare fuel? In the meantime, Justin and Ron had seen fit to join them in the animal graveyard, and Hermione, skipping Justin as a lost cause, clung to Ron and complained again that Tom had grabbed her by the chest. "Yeah, I know, I was there. Remember?" Ron answered obliviously. What? She demanded. "When he grabbed you and Creevy and jumped there. I saw him do it." "What of it?" Ron asked. She sputtered for a few seconds, motioning towards her chest, Tom and Ron. Eventually the youngest, remaining, Weasley, caught on and rolled his eyes. "Grow up, will you?" he all but yelled at his friend. "We have bigger things to worry about than your misplaced sense of propriety." And with that, she was sufficiently mortified to calm down and let them continue their journey. That, or she was just surprised to hear Ron use such a big word as propriety. From there, Ron led the group further into the depths of the Hogwarts basement and to the Wall of Stone, compliments of Gilderoy Lockhart. It was up to Justin and the twins to use a combination of levitation spells and stone melting charms to transfigure an opening. It was rather impressive, forming a large archway with smoothed edges. This all served to make Tom yearn more strongly for a wand, but didn't feel like he deserved one at the moment. A skip and a hop later had them at the serpent-decorated vault door to the chamber proper. "Open up!" Ronald's words came out sounding like English to Tom, but the vault door opened at his command all the same. "First try," Fred whooped. "Our little Ronnie will make it to the rank of Dark Lord by summer's end. You mark my words." Tom's entourage greatly resembled a pack of flamingos as they explored the Chamber of Secrets. Bunched together, inching forward and heads swerving each way, they oot and awed at every statue. Salazar had personnel sculpted each one based on a different type of snake, but the cobra was the most impressive. Fred and George tested the water around the statues and the grime along the rocky walls for anything dark or poisonous. Beyond being bodies of still water left to rot with mold and algae, they could find nothing dangerous. The corpse of Tom's deceased friend was also hugely impressive to them. A few air freshening and water purifying setups, and we could turn this place into a right old water park. Fred concluded. "Don't you think the giant dead basilisk in the middle of the cavern would be a bit of a sore point for customers?" Justin asked as he towed said basilisk corpse. Tom felt his skin prickle in anger at the treatment of his first and only friend. Then he realized his first and only friend was a murderous 1,000-year-old serpent and swore to never share that depressing fact. "Nonsense!" George exclaimed. "Once we sell off all of the useful bits, we can string up the skeleton to the ceiling as a decorational piece. Like the wyvern in defense class." "Deep breaths, Tom. Deep breaths. I can do you one better." Carve a lion statue into the wall above the entrance and put the corpse in its mouth. Said Ron. Throw a springboard on top of Salazar's fat, balding head, and the pool under his mouth would be the main attraction. Said Creevy. Ooh, I like that idea. What say you, Minerva? They all froze in place at the sound of the new, wispy voice. Quite tempting, Headmaster. While I'm sure I am more than up to the taste of making these fantasies come true, I would be more interested in adding some Glissio charms to the pipe entrance and making it into a water slide. Minnie answered Dumbledore. A tirade of choice expletives was exchanged between the students, Tom very much included, with little care for loss of house points. The headmaster and the woman who, apparently, became deputy headmistress in recent years smiled at their expense. The sallow, greasy-haired man at their back seemed less amused, much more disheveled, and like he was in desperate need of a shave. Dumbledore clapped once. Now, you had a lovely adventure, but you all really must return to your treatment. It doesn't take an eye as trained as mine to see you all buckling under the pain in your joints. The headmaster said smilingly. It was true. They winced with every movement, those still petrified bits of meat and bone in their bodies still causing damage. His compatriots groaned in objection, all the while their bodies betrayed them, and they trudged along to the entrance all the same. Wait! Even Tom was surprised by the objection coming from his mouth. All eyes turned to him. Please, sir, they came here looking for answers, looking for closure. Let them get their fill of the thing that almost killed them. Let them do their investigating. Let them find closure for those two they lost. Let them cope. Dumbledore schooled his features to one of calm consideration, the one only he could pull off. As he glanced between Tom and his 6 companions, nobody made a sound until, very well, you may stay, and under our supervision, conduct your investigation. Dumbledore relented. Do not get within 2 meters of the mouth. The others hooped and got to work. Tom absent-mindedly noted the spells Fred and George took to casting as the greasy-haired man approached him. Hair, skin, and blood detection charms. Spells used by crime scene investigators. Unsurprisingly, they got results near the large inkstand near the... Here! The man Snape shoved a vial of something into Tom's hands. It was a bile-restoring potion, the last of his regimen until he was good as new. He made to thank the man only to realize that the potion's master was uncomfortably close. Close enough to get a really good look at. He looked like shit. Utter shit. His eyes were sunken in the way sleep deprivation does to a man. It couldn't have been less than 4 days since he'd last shaved by the state of his face, and his eyes were bloodshot. The smell of alcohol and unwashedness came off of him in waves. He barely noticed that Snape was studying his own face, gazing deeply into his eyes as if he might find something there. Tom could even see the moment Snape realized he wasn't going to find whatever he was looking for, and, for a split second, he looked on the verge of tears. Tom blinked, and the cold exterior of the potion's teacher he had so many memories of hating was back. A sneer and billowing of cloak later, and Snape stormed away. What a strange man. Tom took his potion and waited for the other students to finish here, then returned to his house arrest. Want your story written? I take commissions now. You can pay me to write your fanfiction or original works. My prices are as follows. $25 per 1,000 words of fanfiction, with some wiggle room. I don't pad my work. You also get to video chat with me as I type the first chapter. $25 per 500 words for original works, so anything that is not fanfiction. I also charge $25 per 500 words for smut or fetish materials. Price is subject to change in the future. Check with me. Become a patron. NonsensicalRants. You can also still become a patron for $1 to get access to future chapters 2 weeks early and vote on which stories I update next. 6. Life in Azkaban. Chapter 6. Life in Azkaban. Keep your damn hands on the wall. The Auror yelled. Sirius made a show of rubbing his wrists as the shackles fell to the ground. A small act of disobedience before complying and putting his palms flat against the stone wall all the same. The guard punished him for the show by giving him another pat down before shoving him into the hall. It was a charade, of course. It wouldn't do to have people suspect he could slip out of his shackles at any time, nor that he did so regularly. That privilege would be taken away faster than a golden snitch charmed frictionless and fired from a cannon. His secret identity as Padfoot must be kept a secret. The line of prisoners stretched for nearly a quarter-mile and echoed with waves of childish glee. Many of them were quite literally bouncing on their toes as they waited for the guards to finish opening the cells behind them. You see, today was a special day. Today was Wednesday. That might not mean much to normal people, but for prisoners in Azkaban, Wednesdays are a holiday, resembling the illegitimate love child of Christmas and the end of Lent. A day off from the torture of their cells. A day in which the Dementors are removed from the prison for debriefing, code word for a process much more disgusting than the euphemism would imply. Most importantly, it was a day that all prisoners were brought to the surface to bask in the sun while enjoying luxuries brought in specifically for the event. This might seem like a kindness at first glance, but it was not done for the sake of the prisoners. It was done to keep the Dementors sated with renewed happy memories to feed off of. Most prisoners could not, for the life of them, remember anything from any prior Wednesday. Sirius could. There's a trick to it, but it almost isn't worth the effort. It may also seem odd that this is done on Wednesday instead of Sunday like every other place in Western civilization. The reason for this, to quote the warden, in the off chance the Bible isn't a load of horse shit intended to keep the downtrodden from hanging their illegitimate rulers by their entrails, I don't want to risk any of your immortal souls being saved. It's hell for you dirtbags. Sirius could respect that, though he suspected the reason was more practical. No sane person would willingly spend a Sunday interviewing Dementors or babysitting convicted murderers and rapists. Asking said warden why the equally more likely Friday or Saturday wasn't chosen for the day off would elicit similar concerns about the religions of Pinocchio-nosed self-victimized usurious misers and Bachabatsi raping, baby-mutilating goat fuckers who reserved those respective days for worship. Most of the prisoners would love the man for his deliciously vicious misanthropy if they weren't subject to his rule. Sirius loved him for his uncanny ability to twist the once beautiful language of his motherland into the most scathing of insults and bile-raising descriptions, creating something altogether new and beautiful in its own way. Falsely imprisoned or not, Sirius fully intended to flood Azkaban's mailbox with love letters to the withered goblin should he ever live beyond its walls again. So yeah, Wednesdays are nice. It took another 10 minutes for the Aurors to work their way to the end of the hall behind him, and only then did they shuffle along towards the exit. Sirius exchanged a glance with his younger brother. The two were dying to discuss this Horcrux issue in detail, but it wasn't a conversation to have by yelling to each other's cells when dozens of criminals and marked Death Eaters are within earshot. Sirius knew what a Horcrux was vaguely, in that it was a one-way ticket to making out with a Dementor if you were discovered to have made one. Not that you'd find the legislation stating such. Secretly making something illegal and punishable by the utter destruction of your soul would be repulsive in any other scenario. But in this instance, Sirius heartily approved of the ministry's decision. The rusted steel door at the end of the hall opened to a wide cavern somewhat reminiscent of the Hogwarts Grand Staircase. If that staircase were made up of hundreds of salvage fire escape ladders lazily strung about and capable of asexually reproducing and multiplying well beyond the cavern's capacity. The walls were embedded with decrepit steel doors with massive turned dials where the stairs met stone. All were likely salvaged from Muggle military vessels run ashore of the prison during the Great Wars. Those were some unfortunate Allied sailors. They ascended the stairs slowly. The eerie carvings on the sections of walls free of doors were eroded from centuries, if not millennia, of reign. Despite the wear, they still resembled the faces they once depicted, though they now looked to be in agony and misery, strongly adding to the total despair of the place. Most of the prisoners, made jumpy from years of incarceration, moved at an annoyingly slow pace, as they no doubt hallucinated the carvings moving or speaking to them. Progress was slow, but they eventually reached the top of the staircase, just shy of a ceiling inlaid with a Quidditch pitch-sized vault door. The top step of the stairs leveled off into a wide catwalk where they were instructed to line up as the vault door opened. The clicking and grinding of gears, locks, and other internal mechanisms Sirius couldn't begin to comprehend drowned out the metal thuds of the prisoner's footsteps as the vault door opened, flooding the prison with fresh air and sunlight. The platform they stood on rose in conjunction with the vault splitting, and they reached the surface just as the door finished opening. Sirius took a deep breath as the hills along the horizon waved at him like a friendly cashier. The island of Azkaban was larger than most would suspect. Whereas most people imagined a single spire jutting out of a stone outcropping like Rockall, which is true when submerged during high tide. On clear days it more resembled Lundy, but rounder and flatter. Patches of dirt accumulated on the rocky surface resembling ancient Roman roads gave birth to patches of grass, and the odd tree or two between massive four-story walls of similar design and in a similarly derelict state as the prison proper, which themselves enclosed the entire island. Tents and modern constructions blocked out most of the horizon, which itself was blocked by the black walls, which did nothing to hide the delicious smell of the open sea. Nobody knew who built the walls, nor the paved surface of the island, nor the deep tunnels beneath the vault doors. It was presumed to be the same people who carved the faces into the walls inside. Many believe clues to the builder's identity could be found in the sealed-off areas in the deepest sections of the prison, but nobody thought it was important enough to risk whatever dangers lurked below. Fear of the unknown and all that. There was a universal but unstated agreement among wizards that knowledge of the people who built Azkaban was better left buried in the unexplored tunnels and causeways. Their block was lead across the field to the edge of the island where they stood before the outer wall. Painted upon its surface was a bright red tree that on close inspection was made up entirely of bloodied handprints whose color neither fades nor washes away. Another mystery of the island better left alone. The warden, a nasty goblin by the name of Caltrip, stood there waiting for their arrival. He carried a large knobkerrie, which he held in front of him like a cane. It was a type of club made of goblin silver and had a core of acromantulous spinneret, and with which they had all seen him wield magic like that of wizards. It was not a wand. Goblins are not allowed to have wands. By every legal standard, it was not a wand. All registered documents regarding the weapon made it very clear that it was not a wand. But if it walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and bites like a duck, is it not a duck? Long tables manned by junior aurors or aurors in training sported all manner of food donated by relatives or friends of the incarcerated. There were also a dozen curtained stalls with piles of clean prison fatigues beside it. After each person had taken a scalding hot shower and changed into clean clothes, they were lined up in front of the row of tables and given trays with indented cavities to load up on food. Each dish in the prison potluck had the names of the donator attached to it, along with a small message to the person whose benefit it was donated. Sissy always made sure to donate a myriad of fancy soups to Regulus, Sirius, and Bellatrix. Andromeda too sent hearty and more filling dishes for her sister and cousins. Bless their souls, but the former Black sisters still cared for them all. Even though Sissy knew Sirius had fought against Voldemort, and Andromeda surely felt appalled by Bellatrix's crimes, the love was still there. Mrs. Goyle and Grab would always send homemade confectionaries and massive ham roasts, respectively. The brothers Black shuffled down the aisle, taking their position at the back of the line and making sure to remain close as they filled up their trays. Reading the missives along the way proved mostly futile, as the usual Death Eater sympathizers were never very verbose in their attempts to cheer the prisoners up. Sirius did notice one oddity, a donation of stuffed chocolate truffles identifying Fenrir Greyback as the recipient. The werewolf leader had never gotten a donation before, and if that weren't odd enough, the gift was from a person writing under a pseudonym. To recognize the indignity of being caged like feral, howling beasts, I offer your packed contingency this most delicate of treats. Sincerely, the Half-Blood Prince. What a pompous moniker. Sirius was sure he and this prince fellow wouldn't get along well in person, but perhaps the fact it was sat beside the usual platter of handmade sushi snovellis donated to Reggie was discoloring his first impression. That his old nemesis was still best friends with his brother was a point of contention on the rare occasions they talked. He loaded his tray up with these truffles and forewent the sushi. He'd jump into a lake of inferi before eating food prepared by the potion's master. especially food involving raw meat. It was near the end of the table that they finally got to Andromeda's cast iron pot of sweet, corned beef, but despite it looking and smelling like heaven, it was the two people manning it that caught Sirius and Regulus's attention. It was a girl barely out of Hogwarts. Her heart-shaped face and almond eyes looked so very familiar, though her lime green hair and unnaturally perfect skin made her look decidedly odd. He would have chalked up the porcelain skin to makeup or a glamour if he wasn't adept at identifying both and noticed she had neither. He got a distinct feeling in his gut that he knew this girl. The black man behind her, however, was someone he definitely knew. Kingsley. Sirius greeted with a nod. Sirius. He greeted back with a similar nod. Gotta hand it to him. Despite the bad blood between the two former Order members, he kept a polite and respectful demeanor. Still, he couldn't quite shake his curiosity for the girl. Who? Sirius asked vaguely as he took in her two perfect features. She was pretty sure, but she didn't command his interest as most beautiful women did. Possibly because of her young age, but more likely the feeling that he knew her. Reggie figured it out first, though. Nymphadora, his brother exclaimed as he snapped his fingers in realization. And when her lime green hair turned a fiery red, he recognized their niece as well. My God, we haven't seen you since you were 7. Sirius gushed. She was still a cute pouted too. Did you help with the food? Sirius pressed on. I seem to remember Andromeda having a hard time teaching you to cook when I last visited, but you always did love making Uncle Siri taste your attempts at cookies. She outright snarled at him. And as she opened her mouth to retort, Sirius noticed Kingsley write something on a tiny notepad as he observed. Ah, so this was a psychological evaluation of the girl. See how she responds to the emotional distress of being exposed to her horrific relatives. Kinda screwed up when you think about it. Think I would ever make food for you? NYM's response broke through his thought. Sorry, what now? Sirius asked her to repeat herself. She shrugged. I'm not in the habit of cooking food for murderers, Uncle Siri. So no, none of this was my handiwork. NYM went on. Gone on any muggle killing sprees lately? Can't recall ever murdering muggles in my life, actually. Sirius retorted. I think you might have me confused for somebody else. In fact, I've never murdered anybody save for Death Eaters. And 3 of his best friends. He left that unstated. He was brought back to reality when Kingsley, of all people, broke his calm countenance and snorted. I'm sure your conviction records are proof enough to the contrary of that claim, Sirius. His deep booming voice. Conviction records. Regulus jumped back into the conversation. You finally get your day in court recently, Siri? Why didn't you tell me they finally convicted you for the crime you were in prison for? Congratulations. He slapped Sirius hard on the back to accentuate his sarcastic acting, but Sirius somehow managed to smother a grin. Actually, no. 12 years in Azkaban, and I still haven't seen the inside of a courtroom. Sirius said before locking eyes with Kingsley. You might want to look into that, Shacklebolt. Their trays were as full of food as they were going to get, and that was as good a place as any to leave the conversation off at. So they excused themselves. Just before they were far enough away to be out of earshot, Sirius decided to put in one last barb. Oh, and Kingsley. The man turned to being called to. You might also want to look into who the Potters made as secret keeper. Because I declined the role. There. Let him chew on that. Even if he didn't believe him, the claim of innocence would surely reach Dumbledore. And the old man wouldn't be able to prevent himself from at least coming in to see him and promptly getting him a trial. Win or lose one way or another, he was getting out of Azkaban. The time for wallowing in guilt was over. He needed out. If he got cleared, he'd go straight to his godson. Make things right. If his guilt was determined and he finally got his sentencing, well, a prison with a flawless record sounded like a challenge to break out of, and Sirius-like challenges. They sat on a small outcropping of boulders away from everyone else and dug into the food. They remained silent as they ate, observing their fellow prisoners. Bellatrix sat alone in the shade of a nearby tree, her tray empty save for a bowl of sweet, corned beef and mashed potatoes. The usual madness she wore was gone, replaced by a solemn expression as she stared at the food, unseeing. So far, she had never once actually eaten her sister's food. Best to leave her to her moping. The closest group to the two brothers was Fenrir's gang. a group of former werewolf pack leaders who had been captured and imprisoned along with the child eater. The quartet of werewolves were preoccupied with eating the chocolate truffles, with expressions of orgasmic joy on their faces. "Isn't chocolate supposed to be deadly to dogs and wolves?" Reggie asked offhandedly. Sirius snickered. But curiosity winning out, he ditched working through Narcissus cream of spinach soup and popped one of the truffles into his mouth, and promptly spat it back out into his hand. It wasn't so much disgusting as it was too much of a shock of overpowering flavor. In fact, he had to chew on it a second time to even decipher what was wrong with it before spitting it back out. Whoever this Half-Blood Prince guy was must have been rather well off because he had stuffed the truffle with all 6 varieties of, well, truffles. Usually, you grated the fungal variety of truffles into something like spaghetti or potatoes as a sort of cheese substitute. In fact, his father had always likened it to a very expensive variety of cheese, best paired with actual expensive cheese and wine, all mixed together and put into a chocolate truffle. However, that took a special kind of humor. Perhaps he was wrong about this Half-Blood Prince fellow. He had an interesting sense of humor. Still, his chocolates were awful. At least the person he sent it to was certainly enjoying it. Maybe it was cooked with werewolves in mind? Sirius seemed to recall Remus enjoying some types of dog treats and raw meat when the full moon approached. And if Sirius' mental lunar calendar was correct, then they were 2 days away from having to listen to their blockmates' monthly howling. Perhaps he ought to sneak one back to his cell and eat it as Padfoot? It had always been a trip experimenting with food as a dog before. But would the chocolate poison him like a normal dig? "Oi!" Regulus yelled to the group of cannibals. The 4 of them turned their attention to the brothers Black, and Regulus tossed his handful of chocolates over to them, where they tumbled to the ground at their feet. Sirius repeated this action. Fenrir gave them a dour nod in thanks before calmly bending down to retrieve the chocolates from where they landed and distribute them equally amongst his gang. Now that they were satisfied that nobody was within eavesdropping distance, the pair turned to the topic at hand. "So, about this Horcrux," Sirius prompted, and Regulus told him everything. The lending of creature, the lake of Infery, the potion of nightmares and the locket, the close escape, and his nearly burning down Grimald Place with fiend fire. Fiend fire which led to his own arrest after it got out of his control and spread from the backyard to burn down half a block of houses. "And you're quite sure it was destroyed by the flames?" Sirius asked when the tale was finished. "Positive." Regulus nodded. "I reduced that locket to a twisted mass of metal and screaming black smoke. The piece of the Dark Lord's soul within it was most definitely destroyed." Sirius sighed and scratched his head at the conundrum. "So how could he possibly have come back if I destroyed his anchor to life?" Regulus prompted. Sirius' answer came through his mouth before it even registered in his mind. "Stab in the dark. Maybe he made more than one?" Regulus paled at the suggestion, and Sirius felt the blood drain from his own face as he fully grasped the meaning of what he just said. And so, the conversation turned to means of escape and methods for tracking the other ones down. All the while they plotted, the pair seemed to forget a rather important fact about werewolves. You see, werewolves, like goblins, have excellent hearing. Great for listening in on conversations from far away. Want your story written? I take commissions now. You can pay me to write your fanfiction or original works. My prices are as follows. $25 per 1,000 words of fanfiction, with some wiggle room. I don't pad my work. You also get to video chat with me as I type the first chapter. $25 per 500 words for original works, so anything that is not fanfiction. I also charge $25 per 500 words for smut or fetish materials. Prices subject to change in the future. Check with me. Become a patron. NonsensicalRants. You can also still become a patron for $1 to get access to future chapters 2 weeks early and vote on which stories I update next. 7. Those he is wronged. Chapter 7. Those he's wronged. Tom glowered at the ceiling from his lonesome hospital bed. The other students, cute, annoying, enraging, and loud though they may have been, were released a week prior, thus leaving him alone with his thoughts. He hated to admit it, but he missed them, to the point that refreshing on past coursework, which had always been so cathartic to him in the past, held no interest for him. This uncharacteristic disinterest in schoolwork was compounded by the rising summer heat and feelings of anticipation towards summer break that every student in the school was putting off in a miasma, so thick that it seeped through the walls, and simultaneous, so light that it glided up from the grounds below to tantalize him in his prison of white linen. And if all of that wasn't bad enough, a funeral was being held today on the Hogwarts grounds. A funeral he wasn't invited to. Despite knowing this was for the best, he still felt a sting at being excluded. Shouldn't he be allowed some kind of closure as well? Shouldn't he be allowed to embrace the solemn sight of Ginevra and Harry being lowered into their graves? The only two people ever allowed to be put to rest into the soil consecrated by the four founders so many centuries ago? Bollocks to all of that. His decision made, he flung the covers aside and marched towards the massive oaken doors that seemed so much like prison bars before. His was a simple plan. Sneak up to Gryffindor Tower, snag Harry's cloak, sneak down to the funeral as a silent and unseen observer. He had all of Harry's memories, so hopefully the password was still Caput Draconis. Wait, no, that one was old. Really old. Pig snout? Flibberty-gibbet? He dredged the correct answer up on his way there. Tom checked to see if Madame Pomfrey was preoccupied. She was, and hovered a hand over the door to check for the telltale sensation of a detection ward absent. With a self-satisfied smirk, he wrenched the door open and made a runner. Right into a hard wall of leather and fur. "I reckon ye ain't getting past me, Tom. I reckon you might be right, Ruby," Tom retorted without skipping a beat. "Don't you be calling me the—" Tom shut the door before his first ever friend, in both lives, could finish his sentence. Then again, with his tendency to truncate words, he might have actually been done talking anyways. Plan B then. He crossed to the bathroom, realized he actually had to go pee, and relieved himself before his journey, and then spoke the password to the secret passage that Fred, or was it George, had revealed to him less than a week earlier. Boo! Tom would never admit it, but he might have screamed like a little girl as the transparent, bespectacled ghost leapt out at him. He would happily admit to the manly oof sound he made upon landing flat on his ass after slipping on the damp bathroom tiles, though. Myrtle cackled, snorted, and hiccuped repeatedly in what passed for laughter for the girl. "Did Dumbledore recruit you to guard me too?" Tom asked as he rubbed his backside. "Seems a little cruel and psychologically unhealthy." "No," she slurred. "I volunteered. He refused my help. I came anyways." He deserved this. He was getting everything that was coming to him. Yes, he was. Didn't mean he was giving up, though. He marched out of the bathroom to the one window he knew for certain, from hours of experimentation, could be wriggled open wide enough to squeeze through. He unclasped the hinges, opened it to its maximum width, and then used a nearby lamp to wedge it open even wider. Not for the first time, he found himself thanking his blessings for being so scrawny. Again, in both lives, and squeezed through. He was pretty high up, but the ledges around the windows were just wide enough for him to fit. If he could shimmy the few meters needed to be above a buttress close enough for him to leap down to, then he was golden. From there, he'd just have to count on luck alone to figure out a way down to the ground safely. "Going somewhere, playboy?" Tom turned slowly towards the sound of the oh-so-sultry voice and was unsurprised to find a ghost keeping guard around the windows. He was surprised to see it was not in fact Myrtle Warren, but the Ravenclaw house ghost herself. God, if the Grey Lady wasn't beautiful, though, and as such intimidating. "Air," he said dumbly as he assessed the situation. He glanced between the visibly enraged spirit and the foot he had hanging over the ledge and let the lie flow naturally. "Course not. See, with this heat, I've been sweating in these shoes, so I figured I'd air my feet out before developing an offensive odor and get back inside." She barked. "Yes, ma'am," he squeaked. He squeezed back through the window into the infirmary and racked his brain for any interaction he'd had with the Grey Lady. For the life of him, he couldn't think of a time where they'd so much as spoken before. So what had her hating his guts? Ruby and Warren made sense. He betrayed his friendship with one and killed the other, accidentally but still. Who shoved a stick up her CUN dash? Tom! Minerva's voice came booming into the hospital wing as she marched through the doors. His memories as Harry Potter must be having a stronger effect on him than he thought, because the idea of being caught using such foul language in front of Minnie actually made him jump and cower slightly. Even without his new memories, he never would have been caught dead dropping a C-bomb in front of any lady, let alone Minnie. "The headmaster has summoned you," she said as she came to a stop in front of him. For a split second, he braced himself for the uncomfortable sensation of being acchioed, despite knowing it was impossible to summon living things, which included him. But with men like Dumbledore, magical laws were more akin to guidelines than hard-coded rules. "Oh, okay. Lead the way." And she did, her high-heeled boots setting their pace with each clack of metal on stone, and they passed through the double doors, past Ruby, and out of the hospital wing. He racked the new memories he inherited from Harry, and for the life of him, he couldn't recall her ever wearing heels. Not that it was something little Harry would ever have noticed. His other set of memories, on the other hand, held plenty of examples of a younger, redder-haired Minerva wearing high heels. Usually when she wanted something from him, because even at 17 she knew it drove him crazy the way they sculpted her backside. But that was then. Heels on this older woman didn't do anything near what they did on the young woman he remembered. So if she was wearing them hoping they'd soften him up, she was dead wrong. They continued in silence for several floors, each portrait and ghost conspicuous in their overzealous monitoring of his movements. Dumbledore really wasn't taking any chances, was he? So, Tom broke the awkward quiet as they neared the headmaster's office. Minerva turned her dour expression from the path before them and focused the glare squarely on him. "Did we ever reconnect after you graduated?" The question stopped her in her tracks and made her turn fully towards him. Her expression remained stern and sour as she stared him down in utter silence. They stayed like that for a full minute as she seemed to contemplate her answer. "No," she answered simply. "No, no," she almost growled. Did we ever try to reconnect?" "No," she gritted out. "No, no, Tom," she exploded in her usual way. "We never tried to reconnect." "I did." "Oh." So that's where it was going. Mountains of letters sent and promptly returned unopened. "Hey, if it was during the summer, I was forbidden from receiving owl post by the orphanage. And then," she went on as if she hadn't heard him, "a few years down the road, I learned that the prodigy of Slytherin was working for that sorry excuse of a pawn shop, and I think to myself, oh, maybe I should visit him, get some closure, maybe reignite that flame, and what happens when I walk into Borgin and Burke's?" Tom kept silent as this new information was revealed to him. His past/future he hadn't experienced or heard of. "I find this thing, wearing the face of my old boyfriend, with a smile that was just too wide, teeth just too bright, mannerisms and speech just off enough to make my skin crawl. Like the soul of the boy I loved had been sucked out, and something else, something wrong, had crawled into the empty shell left behind. Something that could only pretend to be him. And it made me want to shower in battery acid to imagine sharing a bed with such a thing as I once had." The accuracy of what she was describing sent a shiver up Tom's spine, and it took all of his discipline not to shudder. The worst part? Nobody believed me when I tried to tell them that this thing wasn't Tom Riddle, that or there was something wholly wrong with you, and you needed help. Lo, they never shut up about how baffling it was to see such a rising star wasting away in a dead-end job when he could have been doing greater things. Only for you to disappear again. Funny enough, the next time you appeared, everyone saw what I saw in that monstrous visage. But by then it was far too late. The awkward silence from before returned, and Tom had neither the strength nor the inclination to try and break it. And even if he wanted to, what could he say to breach this decades-wide chasm between them? He didn't even have the details of how and why he had hurt her, unlike the many times when he'd done so before and tried to make it right. Head bowed, he acquiesced to continue being lead to Dumbledore's office. The silence of their walk was broken upon their arrival at the gargoyle to the headmaster's office by a rather heated screaming match. No sooner had Minerva spoken the password, butterscotch toffee, than did they hear the shouting. And if that abomination remains free of an Azkaban cell, or unkissed by a Dementor, then so help me God you can find yourself a new potions master, you old coot. Snape's voice ricocheted off the walls of the spiral staircase he and Minerva were ascending. The sound of something hitting the ground and splintering rang out and it was soon followed by the sound of a door slamming open. Moments later, Snape stormed past them, and in the brief moment his glare passed over them, Tom got a good look at him. The utter hatred and revulsion in and around his eyes were almost frightening enough to distract from the rest of his appearance, but not quite. His skin was sallow, clammy, and so greasy that Tom could only conclude Harry's potion teacher hadn't showered in at least a week. He certainly hadn't shaved in that time, if his quarter-inch of beard was any indication. He didn't so much as pause as he swept past them, but that split second of eye contact was enough to tell Tom that if Minerva hadn't had her wand out, Snape would have cast a killing curse on him in that brief moment. It was also long enough for him to catch the man's smell and confirm he'd definitely not showered recently. Minerva hurried him the rest of the way up the stairs into the familiar office where he saw the damage Snape had done to Dumbledore's desk. He had apparently flung it against the wall with such force that it shattered. "Trouble in paradise, sir?" Tom couldn't stop the smartass remark from escaping his lips in time and slammed his hand over his mouth as soon as he realized what he had said. Dumbledore, for his part, chuckled. Seeing a grown man so overcome with emotion as to have a burst of accidental magic is a rare and terrible thing to behold. Dumbledore said by way of greeting. His back was turned to them as he was kneeling down to look over the remains of his desk. All the more terrible to know it was I who caused him such pain. And indeed, trouble is a good word to describe things. It seems I am short 2 professors and a head of house for the coming semester. He said, "And all 3 are kind of my fault, huh?" He said, "I mean, I know from Harry's memories that I personally cost you the last 2 defense teachers." Dumbledore chuckled again. "More than you know, Tom. More than you know." He turned his attention to Minerva. "I know it's asking much, but if you think I'm going to waste my breath, let alone my evening, trying to console a man whose only purpose in living, let alone working here, has been stripped away from him thrice now, you have another thing coming." Minerva interrupted. "I could sooner cast Fiend Fire and a Patronus wandlessly and simultaneously than convince that poor soul to carry on." Her reprimand had more of an effect than even she probably expected, because Dumbledore's only response was to skate off into space. Tom had never seen such a haunted look on, well, anybody, and the privateness of whatever was going on with this Snape fellow made him feel highly uncomfortable. In that way you could only feel when overhearing a stranger's personal issues. Minerva excused herself, and Fawkes took her, leaving as reason enough to vanish in flames himself, leaving Tom and Dumbledore alone. "You called for me, sir?" Tom asked, adopting a straight, respectful posture. "I did at that. With my role at the wake completed, and with the open casket still on display, I thought it wise to provide you with distraction, lest you get yourself into trouble." Damn him and his ability to predict his motivations. It always got on his nerves. None of the other teachers could. It was only ever him. And so, I invited a guest to help you re-equip yourself for the coming trials I fear we may be facing soon. He should arrive momentarily. Until then, do you have any pressing questions? Dumbledore asked. It wasn't every day Dumbledore gave carte blanche to ask any question with the veiled promise of absolute honesty in return. Tom asked the first question to pop into his mind. Did I really end up working for Borgin and Burke? Dumbledore actually lost his composure and snorted at the unexpectedly lighthearted question. "Oh yes, you did. It surprised all of us too. But why?" Dumbledore frowned. "I have 2 theories. One only occurred to me much later." He pre-empted. "Are you aware of your mother? Minerva Gaunt Riddle?" Tom shook his head. His research into his heritage had only brought up the name Marvolo Gaunt. He had set his sights on investigating the man this coming summer. 50 Zomas Agol. She was a witch and a parcel-mouth from a long line of parcel-mouths. The daughter of Marvolo Gaunt and sister to Morphin Gaunt. When her brother and father were arrested for assaulting muggles, she absconded with a muggle man by the name of Tom Riddle, Sr., upon your birth. Although I understand you were already aware of that fact. He was indeed. Tracking down phone books from different towns and cities for mention of people with the last name Riddle was a chore he had suffered since before entering Hogwarts. Narrowing down which Tom Riddle was his father was a failure until this most recent lead of the Gaunt family. Well, it's a dark story, but it ends with Minerva penniless and dying on the streets of London, where she eventually wound up pawning a priceless family heirloom to Caractacus Burke just before Christmas. An heirloom that was rightfully yours. Dumbledore explained. Tom was managing to follow along with the story, but he couldn't quite see where it was going. He did, however, spot a single, gaping pothole. Wait, if she managed to pawn something so valuable, then surely she would have been able to afford proper housing and medical attention. But I understand she showed up to the orphanage in rags and dying on the 31st. Dumbledore nodded, and I have no doubt that she did, because as horrible of a deed as it was, Burke paid her a pittance for the famed locket of House Slytherin. Tom felt his blood run cold. He was very familiar with the stories of that locket, and he was very curious as to how angry he should feel towards this Caractacus fellow. How much? Excuse me? How much did he give my mother for one of the most valuable objects in all of the United Kingdom? Dumbledore looked at him pitiably. 10 entire galleons. Tom couldn't stop the look of horror from showing on his face. That wasn't even enough to live off of at the Leaky Cauldron for a month. And the Leaky Cauldron was on the cheap side. He didn't bother masking the hate in his voice with the next question. How did he die? He asked, already suspecting the answer. Under highly suspicious circumstances during your tour working for him. Dumbledore answered without skipping a beat. Tom nodded in satisfaction. He embraced the schadenfreude at this new information and the fantasies it brought with it. Good. Perhaps. I have never condoned murder, and certainly never any of yours. But in this one case, I can understand your actions, and I cannot bring myself to condemn them. Dumbledore consoled. Again, in this one instance, Tom was grateful for this little bit of closure on the mystery of his origins. A mystery that had always haunted him. He wanted to ask more about the gaunts and riddles, but decided it was best to save that for later. This was enough information for now. My other theory is that you had an unnatural lust for ancient artifacts, such as the locket, and were using your position at the shop to hunt them down. Dumbledore continued, but perhaps it's a bit of column A and column B, with column A being premeditated homicide in the name of revenge. Yeah, Tom wondered if Burke had been the first of his premeditated victims. Any further questions before our guest arrives? Dumbledore pressed. Tom racked his brain. With the morbid path their conversation had taken, Tom couldn't help the cacophony of questions whose answers he loathed to hear. What was his kill count? Being the leading one. But he actually settled on the one he'd been trying to work out the answer to himself ever since he came to the epiphany of why he had Harry's memories. A question whose answer eluded him. Why was Harry Potter a Horcrux? He pleaded. The color drained from Dumbledore's face so fast that Tom was genuinely concerned the frown that came with it was the drooping, warning sign of an oncoming stroke. The old man opened his mouth to respond, but whether with an answer or a question Tom didn't. No, because just then the fireplace erupted in emerald green flame and out stepped, of all people, Ollivander, the old wand maker, who had somehow gotten even older since Harry last saw him. Took one look at Tom and seemed to understand the situation entirely. That explains quite a bit, actually, said the younger old man before trying to lift a suitcase from the fireplace. Trying being the operative word. Mr. Ollivander? What are you doing here? Asked Tom. With a grunt, he managed to get the trunk unstuck from the fireplace and into the room proper. He glanced around at the shattered desk, shrugged, and dropped it into the center of the room. Because of one temporarily displaced rising Dark Lord is in need of a wand. Ollivander said theatrically before kicking his trunk. The container bloomed into a cascade of drawers on levers extending outboard like a tree until it practically scraped the ceiling. Each drawer was filled with cavities shaped for scrolls, but within which contained wands of various shapes and sizes. Each wand was painted white and wrapped tightly along the shaft with thick cotton, leaving only the handle visible. I'm sure you don't need me to walk you through the process of testing wand affinities for a second time. So go ahead and test each until you find a good match. Mark whichever one feels close enough to a good match with this. Ollivander instructed before handing him a red Sharpie pen. Ollivander bowed and went over to chat with Dumbledore as Tom set to work. They didn't even bother keeping their voices down. It was almost as if they didn't care if he overheard them rudely discussing his situation in his presence without including him in the conversation. So, is he a time traveler doomed to return to the past? Would be interesting to learn the creation of He Who Must Not Be Named was his own attempt to ensure he didn't create a time paradox, or an attempt to change the future, even if killing him now to prevent that eventuality is off the table. Tom snorted at the ridiculous fantasy the younger old man had come up with as he moved his hands among the drawers. Merely touching the hilt of each wand with his palm was enough to feel any extremely negative or extremely positive reactions. By keeping his touch light, he ensured any negative ones wouldn't be so extreme as to necessitate Dumbledore waving his wand, which he had conspicuously drawn. He suspected that Dumbledore and Ollivander might not completely trust him with a wand of his own. That or both were familiar with the less than peaceful wand matching both he and Harry had gone through. Oh no, that would be too simple. The young man before us is a homunculus reborn from the memories the real Tom Riddle stored in a diary, along with some highly dangerous soul magic and bizarre happenstance. Dumbledore explained in a bit more detail than Tom was comfortable with. Ignoring their conversation, Tom went back over the wands that elicited anything akin to a welcoming warmth or coolness, taking care to avoid the ones that had stung him with sparks of magic that felt like being shocked by a door handle on a dry summer day. He marked the ones that felt positive with the red marker and made to grasp the first one, but when he pulled on it, the damn thing remained firmly wedged into its solet. Done narrowing them down already. Ollivander pressed before leaving the protection of Dumbledore's bosom to examine which wands Tom had marked. Yes, very small selection to choose from, with a few unexpected matches. Let's have a look-see then. He tapped the first wand with his own and released whatever magic kept it in place before handing it to Tom. He waited for Ollivander to tell him the wood and core types, but the man simply stared at him expectantly. Air, Accio Quill. He gestured at one of the fallen quills near Dumbledore's desk. Instead of summoning a quill, the wand made a sizzling sound, and the white cotton wrapped around its edge created a small burn pattern that vaguely resembled a rune of some kind. Ollivander snatched the wand back from him and examined the pattern curiously before returning the wand to its hole. He repeated his earlier process of releasing a second wand and handed it to Tom. And so, the routine repeated as they worked through the few dozen wands that hadn't outright rebelled against Tom's touch. Only one had anything close to a useful affinity to him, but it was placed to the side in the hopes they would find a more perfect match. Eventually, they came to the final wand, which Ollivander handed him with a strange amount of nervousness in the gesture. Tom took it hesitantly, but felt his knees buckle as the utter perfection of the wand's magic merged with that in his body and sang in agreement to him. He barely managed to hold back a groan of pleasure as the wrappings around its length brightened from white to gold, which Tom assumed was the indicator of a perfect match. Wow, I think you really outdid yourself with this one, sir. He complimented as he glanced up at the wand maker, only to see him wearing a frown of disappointment with no small amount of remorse thrown in. One peek at the headmaster showed a similar grimace on his face. What? He asked. Is something wrong with the wand? In lieu of an answer, Ollivander waved his wand at the first one to have nearly accepted him. The white paint melted away from the handle, and the cotton along its shaft faded into dust, revealing a small length of yew with a double spiral pattern along its handle. It was a wand he recognized from his time possessing Minerva. Ollivander repeated the action for the wand in Tom's hand, and he looked on in horror, feeling his face contort in disgust as its true nature was revealed. 11 inches, said Ollivander. Holly, with a phoenix feather as its core. Want your story written? I take commissions now. You can pay me to write your fanfiction or original works. My prices are as follows. $25 per 1,000 words of fanfiction, with some wiggle room. I don't pad my work. You also get to video chat with me as I type the first chapter. $25 per 500 words for original works, so anything that is not fanfiction. I also charge $25 per 500 words for smut or fetish materials. Prices subject to change in the future. Check with me. Become a patron. NonsensicalRants. You can also still become a patron for $1 to get access to future chapters 2 weeks early and vote on which stories I update next. 8. Mysteries of the Soul. Chapter 8. Mysteries of the Soul. Diagon Alley, 1938. Tom walked through the loud, crowded streets of Diagon Alley feeling as utterly alone as if he were stuck in that cave again. The sight of other children his age, and some even younger, brought to mind those things that Alter had dug out of May and Dennis' little minds and projected onto the cave walls, and he knew that the happiness these people exuded couldn't be real. How could it, when things like that were done to children? He kept catching himself crying at times, even in public like this, and quickly remembering to wipe his face before anybody could see. That old wizard doctor, Professor Bumble or something, was perceptive and would have made uncomfortable inquiries when he noticed. Fortunately, there was only one store left to go to, the most important one. He had been careful in getting the cheapest secondhand products for all of his potion supplies, books, and note-taking implements to ensure he had enough money at the end of the day to buy a proper wand. After all, unlike the rest of his equipment, this would have to last him his entire school career, and likely his life thereafter. Ollivanders was staffed by a single man who stood about the counter appearing to the world as if he'd been expecting Tom specifically. He zeroed in on that as the reason for his instant dislike of the man. Before they exchanged a single word, he seemed to already have known him for years. To a private person like Tom, there was no worse possible first impression. They didn't speak save for when the old man told him the wood and core of each wand he handed Tom. Oddly enough, this amplified Tom's impression that the old man could read him, which made him dislike him even more. The old man would hand him a wand. The wand would react violently. Ollivander would make a note, and they narrowed it down to what would hopefully be the perfect match. If Tom were to guess, he would say that he was testing how different core ingredients and different types of wood reacted to him, and from there guess the proper combination, and then find the right match from wands made up of that combination. Curious, Ollivander eventually said as he finished his notes. If my arithmancy is correct, then this would be very curious indeed. Tom didn't comment on the man's rumblings, as they were clearly more for Ollivander's benefit than for his. He left and returned with 2 boxes, opening them both. Holly, 11 inches. Core of a phoenix feather. He indicated the one. You, 13 inches tail feather of the same phoenix. Twin wands. If my calculations are correct, both should be a match. It will be down to fine-tuning to see which one matches you ever so slightly more than the other. Tom picked up the first wand and felt warmth course up his arm as red and gold sparks erupted from the wand's tip. All sense of loneliness disappeared as he held what was, in a way he couldn't explain, the most empathetic and trustworthy companion he'd ever beheld. He waved it in a high arc over his head to create what amounted to a rainbow of gold and red fireworks. Whoa! Tom couldn't help but sigh. Indeed, said Ollivander. Let us see if the other wand has a similar reaction to you. Tom reached for the other wand only to be stopped by Ollivander's staying hand. Let's not have you holding both at once, Tom placed the holly wand back into its box and withdrew the yew wand from the other. The reaction was similar to the other wand, but instead of warmth, it had a pleasant chill which filled him, like putting ice on aching muscles. It also spouted a small amount of silver sparks in addition to the red and gold. He gave it a swing, as if slashing with a knife, and it made a satisfying swishing sound. This one was much longer than the first and thinner to boot. It felt good in its movement, but lacked that same sense of companionship the holly wand had. He placed it back into its box. So which one is for me? Asked Tom. That depends on you. Which do you prefer? Tom considered his answer for 10 seconds before deciding he couldn't come up with one. He needed more information. What are the differences between them? He asked. Ollivander answered as if reciting a textbook. Holly wands are considered protective. They are most happy with wielders who need help overcoming a tendency for anger or impetuousness. They choose owners who are engaged in dangerous and often spiritual quests and are very rare, as few core samples resonate with it. Yew wands, on the other hand, are reputed for their violence. The more superstitious among lovers of wand lore believe them to have power over life and death. Peculiar to have a sample match with a phoenix feather. That last part caught Tom's attention. Does the individual tree the wood came from, and the experiences thereof, affect what type of core material it matches with? Tom asked. And is the same true of the creatures the core materials come from? Ollivander's smile suddenly turned from the polite, plastic smile of a shopkeeper to one genuinely pleased to have met someone. Yes, indeed. The yew tree your wand was born from was found in the ashes of the Big Burn back in 1910. Ollivander explained. It was a series of terrorist arsons in the American Northwest, one covered up by the authorities. Very nasty business. To have lived through such a tragedy and recover? It is not surprising that it matched with a phoenix feather. Tom had to wonder at the stories of the trees the other wands in this shop had to tell. He suddenly had many more superfluous questions on his mind. Were there other tree samples from that fire used for wands? Would trees whom survived or regrew from wildfires be particularly suited to phoenix feathers as a result? What circumstances made a tree's wood more suited to unicorn hair instead of dragon heartstring, and so forth? First day in the wizarding world, and Tom may have already found his calling. Maybe it's better to wait until he had a few years of proper training before making that kind of decision. Either way, a more important decision lay before him, and it was a difficult one. If Tom was a more superstitious sort, he would think fate was testing him, giving him the choice of two diverging destinies. Choose the holly wand and heal. Heal from all the shit this world has thrown at him, and maybe come to be a healer of others as well. Or wield the yew wand and take revenge against those who had wronged him, and more importantly, wronged others. He wanted the holly. He really did. Not for any of the reasons Ollivander gave, but because it was apparently one of the rarest wand types. And it felt good. This alone made it special and made him want it. But the look Bumble something or other had given him, a look of disappointment when he had gone on about how he always knew he was special, stayed his hand. Feeling good and feeling special hadn't done him much good before. And now he was entering a world of people like him. Brilliant people with powers of magic and the mind just like him. If Bumble, What's-His-Face, and Ollivander were mere school teachers and shopkeepers, then what were cutting-edge researchers like? Soldiers? Artists? Criminal investigators? They must be godlike. So, he chose the more difficult wand. He chose the wand that would give him challenge in a world with great and powerful wizards. He chose a wand that made him feel normal and would do away with his need to fight, steal, and connive just to survive. He chose the yew wand. Lo! How disappointing the wizarding world would turn out to be. Headmaster's office. Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry present. It was unsurprising that Ginevra's wand had changed allegiance to him. He had, after all, murdered her. It was the holly and phoenix feather wand that concerned him. He had initially been confused at how well it bonded to him when he first picked it up down in the chamber, but now he knew why. He hadn't recognized it then, but he did now. The wand who wanted him had chosen a bond with Harry Potter. Did it choose him because it could feel the peace of Tom's soul attached to the boy? Did it hope that doing so would lead to it coming into Voldemort's possession, or as a simple means of rivalry with a twin who was favored over it? Did it choose Harry to get revenge on Tom, or to rejoin him? More likely, the wand chose Harry because no other wand could choose him. With the piece of Tom's soul latched to him, any other wand would have difficulty feeling out the person picking them. They would be suited to one, but not the other, or suited to neither, and end up confused. The holly wand, at least, recognized him and chose to be wielded by what it thought was Tom. That, or the less likely case, it accepted both of them. Tom knew the truth, though. Harry Potter was never this wand's owner. He was just the delivery boy, one to be sacrificed at the altar of the wand's true master. You're a sick man, Ollivander. Tom ground out, still holding the holly wand. Ollivander had paid him no mind as he packed up his entire stock and made a non-committal noise. I am a mere merchant of magical ancilla, he said with a straight face. And if this bothers you, my only other option was to dig up the wand of one of your murder victims through grave robbing. This was more palatable to me. Ouch! Need some salted lemon juice to pour into that wound while you're at it? Ollivander finished packing up and retook Ginny's wand. Mr. Potter had no magical relatives to inherit his wand. It is effectively school property. The same is not true for Ginevra's. He explained, I've been invited to the funeral to return it to her. And with that he left through the flue, just as he'd come. Tom and Dumbledore remained in silence. It was left to the headmaster to end it. What have you managed to figure out during your isolated meditations? He asked. Tom made his own non-committal noise, but sobered up quickly. He knew why he was really being isolated in the medical wing, and it wasn't because he was a danger to himself and others, which he was, but because Dumbledore wanted Tom to think, and boy had he been thinking. It's not Harry Potter's memories that I've inherited, he concluded. Dumbledore raised an eyebrow, leaning into his hands on his desk. And how did you come to that conclusion? Because Harry Potter did not remember most anything before the age of 5, like most people. But I do, he explained. I don't exactly have photographic memory, but I do have memories of Harry's life before he was developed enough to start forming any. I remember his first birthday at the Dursleys. He sighed. In fact, I remember everything, all the way back to the moment I cast the killing curse on his face. Tom concluded. It was the Horcrux in his head, experiencing Harry's life as if peeking through the keyhole of his prison cell, searching for any kind of distraction for the burning heat of Lily Potter's sacrificial protection which kept it there. Dumbledore nodded thoughtfully. Fascinating, he concluded. And have you figured out why you don't have your memories from before that night? Tom shook his head. No, and it would kill me to remember murdering the Potters, to say nothing of the many more crimes people refuse to talk about, said Tom. My best guess is that it's like what happened to Quirrell. Dumbledore looked at him for some time. Elaborate. Well, when Harry touched Quirrell, Lily's sacrifice recognized him as Voldemort from the soul fragment of me attached to him, and it destroyed him. Tom explained. So surely the piece of Voldemort's soul trapped inside of Harry would receive the same treatment? Dumbledore nodded for him to continue. So surely the soul fragment inside of Harry would have been cleansed of any real personality or memories by that hellish fire of Lily's love. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for 10 years. Tom finished. Even Lord Voldemort couldn't retain a sense of self or sanity, suffering that kind of onslaught. Dumbledore clapped, not at all in a mocking way either. Tom lost his fight against the small sense of pride he got from the praise. And I suppose you've also figured out how or why the Horcrux inside of Harry fused with you? Oh, that one's easy, said Tom. It eventually regained some semblance of individuality from Harry and figured out its own nature. And it did the one thing shy of divine grace, able to restore a soul. It felt remorse, and likely for some time before you encountered it. It was only as Harry died that it was able to forcibly reattach to you and begin the process of healing your soul, with Harry's memories helping it along. Dumbledore finished for him. There were tears in his eyes as he said all of this, and Tom knew it must ache the old man to see such a beautiful miracle come from this tragedy. And Tom hated himself for agreeing with the unspoken sentiment. Those memories, a life so much like his, but with a completely different path. There wasn't a single other thing on this earth more able to heal Tom's soul and turn him to the light from the monster he was just a week ago. I'm scared, sir, Tom admitted. Not just of the changes I'm experiencing, the emotions I'm feeling, the changes in my personality. I can't tell if I'm more Harry or me. Dumbledore raised an eyebrow and made to respond, but Tom beat him to it. Yeah, I guess my use of pronouns there probably does tell me what's true, Tom said. But more importantly, I'm worried I'll start to remember things from before the soul was attached to little Harry. I'm all but certain they will. Dumbledore confirmed his fear, and like that Tom's mood soured even further. But, Dumbledore continued, you now have 28 years of your own and Harry's memories. And if you are wise in discovering who you are and who you want to be, those memories will become like trials for you. His words only made Tom feel worse. What am I supposed to do, sir? Explore these memories properly. Take strength from the ones you have. Think, feel, and craft your new self into somebody capable of withstanding your dark past once you remember it. Dumbledore explained with conviction. And when it happens, use your and Harry's memories as an anchor against the dark storm. Tom wanted to scream at the man. He made it sound like it was the easiest thing in the world, as if it were inconceivable that Tom wouldn't know how to do any of those things. But he really didn't. So instead of screaming, he placed Harry's wand on the headmaster's desk. What are you doing? The old man asked as if in genuine confusion. Returning the wand and going back to the infirmary? Tom said uncertainly. You can do the latter if you wish, but the wand is yours now. Keep it on you at all times, Dumbledore said. After all, a wand is a wizard's life. Tom looked at him as if he had gone insane. You're trusting me? Tom asked incredulously. With a wand? What's to stop me from sneaking down to the funeral? The basic decency of not sneaking into a place you're perfectly welcome at. Dumbledore answered. You still have Minders watching your every move, of course. But you are more than invited to join me in my walk down to the funeral now and join us in our mourning. Tom took him up on his offer and followed him all the way onto Hogwarts grounds, but chickened out at the last minute. The sight of so many people there mourning him, Harry was too much for him. He knew too much of the boy would bubble up and make an emotional scene in front of people who didn't recognize him. Not just from the trauma of attending what felt like his own funeral, but Ginevra's as well. And with that revelation, he discovered he was far more ashamed and guilty about Ginny than he was Harry. He couldn't really dissect that mind twister right now, so he settled for lapping the Black Lake, watching the crowd from a distance in the cool night air. He watched as they held candlelit vigils. Many of the students who knew him personally all had lengthy turns at his grave. All of the Quidditch teams paid serious respect to him as a competitor, and his teammates all got speaking roles. The closest of his friends, Ron and Hermione, were allowed to make a scene as they broke down on his grave. What was strange was that Draco did the same. He would need to look into what that was about. He didn't have the strength to pay much mind to Ginny's wake, some distant away from Harry's. The entire Weasley family was there, half of whom he didn't recognize in the slightest. He wasn't welcome there, but would wait until everyone was gone to visit the graves. To be buried on Hogwarts grounds? Tom couldn't think of a higher honor. It was such a beautiful evening, too. No clouds. A full moon shining light onto the grounds so that they barely needed all of those torches and candles. Yes, waiting for his turn was no trouble at all. Sirius paced his cell impatiently. An entire week and change had come and gone, and yet he still wasn't thin enough to fit through the bars as Padfoot. The plan was simple, yet eloquent. Abstain from food and paste to burn calories, until his already anorexic frame slimmed even further. Then, as the even more lithe Padfoot, who also had a smaller head, he could squeeze through the bars and flee. From there, it was just a matter of swimming back to the mainland, getting to Grimmauld Place as quickly as possible, and connecting with Creature, indeed maybe Andy or Remus if they were willing to listen. Then return with equipment to break out Regulus and figure things out from there. Regulus had seemed certain that the Ministry would send a large contingent of Dementors to search for him with the Aurors, which would leave the prison less guarded. Less guards meant easier to break into and out of again, right? And they would never expect him to return so quickly. But his body, so accustomed to being malnourished, refused to lose weight as quickly as their mental caloric calculations suggested. It could be a whole nother week, and yet tonight would have been perfect. Tonight the werewolves were making their usual ruckus upon a full moon. The cells at Azkaban were more than capable of containing them, but not their howling. What made this perfect for escaping was the fact that, in their wild glee, Fenrir and his lackeys would attract all of the Dementors to their specially reinforced cell blocks. Most months this amounted to an extra evening free from reliving nightmares for the denizens of this hell. Tonight it made for a perfect distraction for his escape, which made it all the more infuriating. It was then that all too suddenly the howling stopped. Sirius stopped in his pacing as an inexplicable shiver went down his spine. He tried to place why, but it didn't take a genius to figure out. The prison was utterly silent. Clear night, light wind, prisoners sound asleep as they enjoyed a night free of Dementors. It would have been nice if it wasn't so wrong. Had the warden decided to put up silencing wards on the werewolf cells? Had the few Auror guards had enough and decided to leave the cell doors unlocked so the Dementors could have a little snack? These were the more pleasant possibilities floating through his mind at the moment. Sirius walked to his cell door and peeked through the bars to see if Regulus was up and worried too. He saw his brother's face across the hall, and they shared a nod. They both felt it. They both knew something was coming. And yet the explosion of what must have been a missile barreling into Azkaban prison still surprised them enough to send them both vaulting to the floor. The sirens that followed came as less of a surprise. The resumed howling even less so than that. He locked eyes with his brother again, and he was sure they both came to the same conclusion. It looks like our timeline just got bumped up a bit, Regulus said, proving his penchant for understatements hadn't dulled with time. Sirius only hoped the same held true for their dumb luck. Want your story written? I take commissions now. You can pay me to write your fanfiction or original works. My prices are as follows. $25 per 1,000 words of fanfiction, with some wiggle room. I don't pad my work. You also get to video chat with me as I type the first chapter. $25 per 500 words for original works, so anything that is not fanfiction. I also charge $25 per 500 words for smut or fetish materials. Prices subject to change in the future. Check with me. Become a patron. NonsensicalRants. You can also still become a patron for $1 to get access to future chapters 2 weeks early and vote on which stories I update next. 9. Assault on Azkaban Point 1. Chapter 9. Assault on Azkaban Prison Part 1. Padfoot twisted and contorted his body in a valiant effort to squeeze through the bars of his cell door. But he was simply too wide to fit through. He managed to get his head, shoulders, and most of his abdomen through, but his hips proved challenging. Fortunately, he knew a trick for this kind of thing. It was something Peter had shown him way back while sharing muggle magic tricks, specifically how to escape a straitjacket. And so, he dislocated his hip with a loud yelp of pain that would have woken the entire prison were it not for the sound of mortars. Yup, that sounded a lot like mortars. But back to the matter at hand. As with dislocating a shoulder in order to escape a straitjacket, dislocating his hip allowed him to squeeze the last bit through the bars. "Quit your whining and get over here," Regulus Yell whispered from his cell. Padfoot limped pitifully across the dark hall. In dog form, he had much better night vision, and despite knowing the other prisoners couldn't see as well as him, spotting Bellatrix at the bars of her cell made him terrified for his secret getting out. But fortunately, the keenest human eyes couldn't see him in the pitch black of the prison at night. It didn't hurt that his coat was pitch black either. "Okay, hold still, and try not to yip too loud," Regulus instructed as he pulled Sirius close to his cell door. It took some awkward maneuvering, but his brother managed to get him into a position to pop his hip back into place, and this time he managed to bite back any sounds of pain. He may have growled a little, though. "I need you to be your old tough guy self now, Siri," Regulus said. "I know you don't quite have human faculties now, but remember the plan. Find a wand, any wand, and bring it back to me. Failing that, escape back to the mainland and go with Plan B alone." Padfoot nodded and sprinted on his way. The full ache of his recently dislocated bones overshadowed by the instinctual panic coursing through his veins. He could smell something in the air, something rotten, foul, and reptilian. Something that hadn't been in the prison moments before. He made it to the bulkhead door at the end of the hall and crouched in the corner, waiting to find out if anybody had spotted him. Deciding the coast was clear, he shifted back into Sirius and advanced on the portal, only to immediately leap back when it dented inwards with a loud thung. Shifting back into Padfoot, he crouched in the corner again and waited for whatever was trying to break in to succeed. With his heightened senses, he could hear the voice on the other side intone Bombarda twice more, a voice he recognized but couldn't quite place. But when the bulkhead door was blown clean off its hinges and halfway down the hall, he got a face to go with the voice as its owner stepped through the dust and debris. Bartemius Crouch, former head to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Following behind him was Bartemius Crouch, former head to the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Clearly, some polyjuice shenanigans were at play here. Sirius watched as they marched right past him and perked his ears to hopefully hear if anybody was standing guard beyond the doorway. "Oh, my fellow faith fuels," one Barty called out in a sing-song voice. "We come bearing gifts, freedom and blood and vengeance for all." The alacritous Barty advanced on Bellatrix Lestrange's cell, the other on his Sirius' own. One cast an unlocking charm, the other the killing curse. Freeing real Death Eaters and killing falsely accused ones? Yup, enemies. Time to skedaddle. He didn't wait for the quiet Barty to discover the lump on his bed was just pillows and sheets, and chose then to cross the boundary into the wider prison. Thankfully, the great chasm of the pit was empty as far as he could tell, and the two Bardys hadn't seen fit to leave a guard outside the door. He took off upwards, seeing as they were at the bottom and most highly secure section of the city. The great vault door at the top of the chasm lay open and battered, much like the bulkhead door from below. The cheering and howling, figurative and literal, of his fellow prisoners nearly drowned out the sound of rain and fighting coming from above, but he heard it all the same. The long eroded stone faces on the walls seemed to jeer at him as he passed, and the smell of that foul reptilian beast grew stronger. Then a bolt of lightning lit up the prison, crashing outside on the surface of the island. And he saw it. In the poor light, he made out an enormous shape crawling down the adjacent wall, a mere 100 meters away. In the brief glimpse he got of it, he thought it might have been a wingless dragon, but his senses told him it was something deadlier, something unique and new, something with thick, plated scales along its spine like hewn stone and a head far too large for its body, and a tail much too small. Something the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures must have really been asleep on the job for to have allowed such experimental crossbreeding to have been a success. Where were the Aurors? Where were the Dementors? Was something up top keeping them occupied? By the sight of the multicolored lights illuminating the sky, he suspected as much. He padded on, hoping whatever creature was in here with him didn't have true night vision, or being reptilian, thermal vision. Clearly it had one of them, because Sirius heard the warning call of it inhaling deeply, a disgusting, gurgling sound as if it were drowning. And so he veered into the nearest open and well-lit hallway to avoid what he expected was an oncoming ball of fire. What ended up colliding with the staircase where he had just been was far worse. A putrid sludge, thick as tar and clearly acidic, advanced through the hallway after him, but not by much. He turned his head to see it as he ran, and it bubbled sinisterly in the light of the torches. The combination of its incomparable stench and his turning back to look were the only reasons he could have possibly failed to see the figure he then collided with, for it was both massive and stench-ridden as well. "Ah, puppy," the werewolf spoke out in deep tones. "A speaking werewolf? So wolfsbane potion then." That was at once a relief and a further problem, for Sirius recognized this werewolf, and he couldn't decide if he'd rather face him feral or lucid. "And however did you get in here?" asked Greyback as two smaller werewolves circled around. "Crap. Wait," Greyback ordered his lackeys. He then sniffed the air in Padfoot's direction before pausing to think. Padfoot doubted very much he could smell anything over the stench of that creature's spit pooling not 20 meters from them, but he could be wrong. Saul surely had senses of smells than dogs, yes? "Leave us. Free as many prisoners as you can, whether they belong to the Dark Lord or not, and be cautious to avoid whatever that creature out there is." They barked their assent and fled up different side stairs, leaving Sirius and Greyback alone. They stared at each other in silence, Sirius coiled up and ready to spring, and Greyback taking a deep breath. "I have a proposition for you, Mr. Black." "Double crap." Padfoot let out a huff in surrender and shifted back into Sirius Black. He made a show of straightening out his filthy prison fatigues before motioning for the werewolf to continue. "Let's hear it then," he said. "Your niece is upstairs. Fighting," Greyback said simply. "Triple crap. Of all the nights. You are not in a position to protect her. But I am. Likewise, I am not in a position where I can get to and protect my niece." "But you are." Sirius' Azkaban-addled mind took a while to chew on that before he registered his surprise. "You have a niece." "Indeed. The daughter of my sister, deceased and suffering from a blood curse. Her mother was a brilliant enchantress and poisoned her to have the touch of death to transformed werewolves." That sounded like truly difficult but not implausible magic. It sounds like a rather excessive way to protect her, and it sounds like she didn't want you anywhere near her. "I must refuse. Consequences be what they may." Sirius answered with his head lowered, ready to shift and run. "Oh no, you misunderstand," Fenrir said, making a calming motion with his hands. A motion that looked decidedly odd on a fully transformed werewolf. "My sister and I were very close. She was attempting to immunize her to leakinism and hopefully collect antibodies that could help cure the disease." Fenrir explained. "Unfortunately, She always was an overachiever. Her possible cure worked too well. Sirius could detect no deceit, so nodded in a tentative agreement to hear him out. "What do you propose?" Sirius demanded. "You deliver my letter to her, promise to watch over her in my stead, and I promise I and my pack will get Nymphadora off this rock safely." Greyback concluded. Sirius stared at him with the blanket's expression he could manage. "This hardly seems like a fair exchange. You protect my niece for one night. I protect yours forever." He complained. "Well, the way I see it, I have more leverage in this exchange." Greyback fried, pointedly flexing his impressive claws. Sirius looked between the werewolf in front of him and the wretched sludge melting the entire hallway behind him. He made a fine point. A sharp one, if you will, but perhaps I should sweeten the deal. Greyback conceded. "I will further cover your escape and help you remain undercover so long as you achieve the task you have agreed to." That was much fairer. But still, what about my brother? Sirius asked. "Your brother's safety is already assured. He does not need protection, but you'll just have to take my word for that. Our time grows short. I need your answer." Greyback said in the air of an ultimatum. Sirius didn't even bother to pretend to consider the offer. It was a pretty good deal. "Very well. Where is this letter?" Sirius acquiesced. "In my cell, block 6, row 3, cell at the end." Fenrir explained. That was 4 floors up, on the way to where he was headed anyways. "And where is your niece?" Sirius demanded. "The delivery address is on the envelope. Naturally, I cannot send it as I do not have mailing privileges, and her father would likely intercept the letter anyways." "Perfectly understandable. Now go," Fenrir barked. Sirius transformed back into Padfoot and charged on the left set of stairs behind Fenrir. Sprinting up staircases after years of inactivity, and while in the middle of a weeks-long fast proved taxing, however, and he made it up 2 whole flights before collapsing in an alcove. He took several minutes to catch his breath. Good thing, too, because the action saved him from being trampled by a platoon of Aurora charging past. He spotted Kingsley among them. An old training resurfaced as the desire to fall in line and follow him towards the action nearly overcame him. Fortunately, he regained enough of his own faculties to resist that urge and instead padded along in the direction they came from. He lost count of which floor he was on, but the lack of cells, presence of Potter plants, and the large mess hall suggested this area was reserved for on-duty Aurors. Oh look, the hot bar was still on and full. And so Sirius finally broke his fast as Padfoot and stole as much food as his belly could handle. In all honesty, it wasn't much. Weeks of only having a bite, literally of food per meal, and nothing else, but water lead to a stomach not capable of handling more than a few scraps. It was probably for the best. He had a long swim ahead of him, and it wouldn't do to make it on a full stomach. He only managed to get a few bites of egg and some rye bread before another bombardment from whoever was attacking the prison shook the structure so thoroughly that it knocked most of the furniture on the ground. A few ceiling tiles even came loose and cashed down onto the lunch benches, denting them terribly and covering floor in dislodged dust. Lunch break is over. Back to running. Severus dismounted the Thestral and took his first step onto Azkaban. Kura, Hagrid had named her. She was the only Thestral who would consent to pulling a carriage with Severus in it, and as such they had formed a bond over the years. A bond that had allowed him to claim her as his familiar. "Severus, my friend, you look like shit," Lucius greeted as he approached. Severus turned in time to see his greatest friend try to hide his wrinkled nose at the smell of unwashed alcoholic that permeated the air he walked through. He'd been sober for a whole day now, but showers got in the way of sulking in hate and writing letters to everybody he could possibly blackmail or bribe into this. Friend or foe? The pleasantries are unnecessary, Lucius, Severus said as he surveyed the wands for hire that formed a wall around the man that had declared Severus godfather to his only heir. "I know I have wronged you in threatening you as I did, but I couldn't take any chances. After tonight, if you never wish to speak to me again, I will respect your wishes and leave you, Narcissa and Draco, in peace." Lucius considered him for a moment before deflating, pomp and antagonism fleeing his body. He took Severus by the shoulder and lead him a few feet away, so the hired men couldn't overhear. They are entirely necessary. Even now I respect and love you, Severus, as does Narcissa and my precious Draco. I'm just confused, Lucius whispered conspiratorially. He waved towards the sky of fiery rockets and spellfire. What is the point of all this? Of the superfluous threats and blackmail, when you know I would move the world for you if you merely asked? Revenge, Lucius. Severus answered as another barrage of Muggle armaments hammered the prison. I am doing this all for revenge, and I will throw away whatever it is I had with you, or Narcissa, or Igor, or the others who have reared their heads since the mark reappeared to have it. Lucius backed away from him, and he locked eyes with the blonde. And I pray you will forgive me, both for what I have done and what is to come, but for now consider yourself released. He explained as he proffered a black diary he had pilfered from the headmaster's personal library. Any aid you provide me from the future is entirely your own, and I will not harass you or your beautiful family any further. But know the man who oversaw your wedding vows and delivered your only child is dead, and that Albus Dumbledore killed him. The husk you see before you is a spirit of vengeance, and I will stop at nothing to complete my purpose. I will burn down any bridges, scale any cliff, shatter any castle, to make them hurt as I have been warned. Lucius took the ruined Horcrux, and Severus advanced on the veritable army of criminals and bounty hunters the blonde had hired on his command. There were well over 100 of them, though only 8 here. If Lucius were to be believed, he'd gotten hold of everybody from the Korean maniac Kwon Chang-ho and his gun, toting companion James Collins, to the bizarre African sorcerer Imhotep, the 123rd. The best were here and at his beck and call. They seemed to have things well underway, though only stragglers remained near the edge of the island to greet him, with the heavy hitters deeper inside hitting as heavily as they could, which turnout was rather heavy. Guide me to the deep cells holding the Dark Lord's most faithful. I have an old friend there whom I have longed to be reunited with, and who I know longs to help me in at least half of my revenge. Severus commanded. The no-named, but well-paid, hit wizards nodded and bowed before turning heel and leading Severus towards his ultimate goal. Lucius followed at the rear, duty making way to loyalty. And possibly curiosity. Want your story written? I take commissions now. You can pay me to write your fanfiction or original works. My prices are as follows. $25 per 1,000 words of fanfiction, with some wiggle room. I don't pad my work. You also get to video chat with me as I type the first chapter. $25 per 500 words for original works, so anything that is not fanfiction. I also charge $25 per 500 words for smut or fetish materials. Price is subject to change in the future. Check with me. Become a patron. NonsensicalRants. You can also still become a patron for $1 to get access to future chapters 2 weeks early and vote on which stories I update next. 10. Assault on Azkaban Point 2. Chapter 10. Assault on Azkaban Part 2. Regulus stepped out of his cell with the others as they were all opened. To his right, Bellatrix and Anandalahov did the same. To his left, Augustus arose. The clink of their cells being opened by the 2 crouches stirred the rest of the prisoners on the floor. But before the 2 Bardys could advance any further, Bellatrix confronted them. "Which one of you is the real Barty Crouch?" she asked. The one that seemed significantly less dazed, with the less glossy eyes, answered with a strange glee. "Both of us, my dear Bella," he exclaimed cheerfully. Bella stared at him for a moment and came to the answer before Regulus. "Junior," she hissed. "Guilty as charged, but we all knew that already." Barty Jr. joked, his personality sounding so strange in his father's voice. "And him?" Augustus asked. "Imperious. He had me under it for years. Shockingly good at casting it, but couldn't take it very well." Barty explained. "Now come on. Our new leader is waiting for us." "New leader?" Regulus shared a look with Bella, Antonin, and Augustus. The same question was surely on their minds. If not Voldemort, then whom? Crouch Jr. marched past them down the hall, opening cells as he went, while Senior stayed near the exit to the rest of the prison, glassy-eyed and dazed. The man was surely only alive because he was of some use to his son and their new leader. But what life he had now surely involved a lot of cruciatus in addition to the imperious he was laboring under. In short, Order Mulciber, Rodolphus, Rabaston, and Travers were released from their cells. Gibbon and Jugson came last at the end of the hall and took some coaxing to come out. It was all strangely solemn, like none of them could really believe they were being released. Everyone was dazed and confused and certain that they were dreaming. Not Regulus, though. He was terrified. This was all very, very bad. He needed to get to Sirius. No! Sirius needed to get the hell out of Azkaban and as far away as possible. Sure, the wizarding world thought him a traitor and mass murderer, but everyone there knew better. Knew he was never one of theirs. His constant insistence that he was innocent was proof enough of that. And once they all got their wands back, which was surely the next order of business for their rescuers, they would surely kill him. If not sooner. Whose cell was this? Junior asked, breaking Regulus out of his internal debate. Time to put on his game face. My blood traitor brother. Regulus answered with a snarl. Don't kill him. I want him to stay here and rot. Junior blinked at him, then back into the cell. There's nobody here. Junior said with a thumb pointed into the cell. Everyone stalked over to the cell in question. Regulus did his best to seem as confused and shocked as everyone else. Junior went so far as to cast a hominum revelio in it. Nothing. Could you have opened the door earlier and let him out without looking? Bellatrix asked. And slinked away while we were preoccupied? Antonin asked in his thick Russian accent. He would have had to go past all three of us without us noticing. Though, Bellatrix pointed out, indicating herself, Antonin, and Crouch Jr. Was anybody awake and aware before we came in? Junior asked. Everyone shook their heads. So if guards came in to take him out to put him in a private location, none of you would have noticed? Junior clarified. Regulus shared a look with Bella. The only time guards took prisoners out of their cells for a private room was to share news of a death, to let them mourn. But if somebody in their family died, then they would have removed Bella and Regulus too. Of course, Regulus knew he wasn't removed, but Junior seemed to think they might have. Which means, who died? Bella asked. Sirius patted down the dead and maimed Aurors for any sign of a wand, but with no luck. Of course the attackers would snag any wands they found, no doubt intending to rearm the prisoners inside. Death Eaters in particular, if his suspicions were right. His best bet would be to find someone dead from the artillery. He half sprinted and half limped away down the corridor from the mess hall, where the deceased line cooks he had searched lay dead. Found the lead cook's office, with all of the inventory and requisitions paperwork splayed out for him to see. No head cook, though. Come on, let there be a wand or weapon or so anything. He pleaded as he began rifling through the drawers. Employment contracts, background check forms, scheduling, and a very loud, whistling noise in the wooden cupboard at the back. Following the whistling sound, he opened it to find a sneakoscope. The opposite of useful when trying to sneak around, especially since it was surely detecting him. He grasped it and threw it out of the barred window, then went back to checking the cupboard. Just photos, frames, and some spare cooking utensils, including a knife set. It'll have to do, Sirius said to himself, pulling each knife out of its housing until he found one he liked. He settled for a boning knife. He was very tempted to take the pretty Damascus chef's knife, but the boning knife would make for better stabbing and was more easily concealed, and could still do the job of cutting or slicing materials if need be. Don't move. Sirius heard a voice from behind him as he felt the tip of a wand pressed to the base of his skull. Put my knife down. He obeyed the voice, relieved to find out it was a chef and not any of the people attacking the fortress. But he didn't relax too much. While his likelihood of surviving this encounter just skyrocketed, he was still in a suboptimal position. Okay, you're in charge. I will do as you say. Let's stay calm, Sirius said as he raised his hands. The next second something happened. A loud bang and bright flash of light stole his senses and his feet from him, and he fell to the ground. For a moment, he thought the chef had blown his brains out with an explosive hex, and he was somehow still aware of his bodily pain, and that he was going to enter that tunnel any moment now. But then the sound of the bombardment returned to his ears, and the sight of the ruined ceiling returned to his eyes. Half of the room was gone. Just gone. Smoke and dust was still settling, and Sirius' brain was still stalling as he tried to figure out what just happened. He coughed up a lungful of dust and ash, but managed to slowly pick himself up off of the ground and confirmed the evidence of his eyes. Yup, the wall with the barred window and a good chunk of the ceiling, floor, and two other walls connected to it was erased from existence. He had just narrowly survived a shelling. He patted himself down to make sure he had all of his body parts and checked for blood. He didn't feel any injuries, but his heartbeat was so loud in his ringing ears that he was pretty sure he was too high on adrenaline to feel the Cruciatus curse at the moment. Finding no harm to his person, save a lot of dirt, he checked on the chef that had stuck him up. One look at him was enough to determine he didn't need to check for a pulse. The girthy man had blocked most of the shrapnel and stone that would have gotten Sirius. He felt like a bastard for it, but Sirius dived straight for the wand still clutched in the man's lifeless hand. He tested it out by waving it over himself with a skin-cleaning charm, and it worked kind of. The charm normally didn't prickle so much and tended to get the inside of one's clothes. So he cast a clothes-cleaning charm on top of it and felt good as new. Or as new as he could be until he got himself a hot bath. Now for the real test. He jabbed the edge of his hip, the one he had broken as padfoot, and cast a numbing charm. The sweet relief of the ache felt like heaven. All right then, the wand was a decent enough match. Not perfect, but not bad. And now he had a new route out of here, with less risk of coming across any of the clearly well-armed attackers, whom he somehow suspected were not his friends. Whoa! Sirius gasped as he reached the edge of the cliff face, now accessible by the wall-turned window. The prison was at low tide, with the sea water lapping at the rock faces just 5 meters beneath him. But out at sea was a Muggle battleship, its cannons trained on and firing upon the cliff face. It looked old, and was certainly poorly kept based on what little of its condition Sirius could make out in the bright moonlight. It could have been a World War I vessel, but he wasn't an expert on these things. He looked below to the choppy waters and back through the door to the hallway. Now seemed like the right time to flee. But without Regulus, he had no idea if these attackers were friends or foes of Death Eaters. They could just as easily be a vigilante militia intent on killing Voldemort's surviving followers before they could be reunited, as they could be the Dark Lord's forces. The latter did seem more likely, by a lot. But if it was the former, fleeing now was still the best option. If Regulus were to die, he would still be able to get word of Voldemort's Horcruxes to those able to do something about it. If they both survived, then there were 2 of them, one in the Dark Lord's ranks, able to do something about it. But if he went back and it turned out the attack was meant to kill him, he would risk both of them dying. Fleeing now ensured at least he made it out alive, and there was a good chance Regulus was going to as well. With all this in mind, he recast the numbing charm on his hip, placed the wand in his teeth, and dived. The icy cold water seeped into his bones as he plunged into the inky depths. He screamed through his gritted teeth, not just at the physical cold, but the spiritual cold of the Dementors he could now feel deep below. The latter died away when he resurfaced as Padfoot, wand still clenched in his jaws. And so, he paddled away towards where he hoped the far shore awaited. Tom stood in front of the 2 small tombs in silence. They had chosen a lovely place to entomb Harry and Ginny. The small island at the mouth of the Black Lake, far away from the castle, where it opened out into the river. 2 small, wooden bridges connected the island to either shore of the Black Lake and the 2 paths back up to the castle. Quidditch players and fitness fanatics would now jog past them for the rest of time, on days when they didn't have the pitch. Something about that pointless thought felt right. It also felt right for them to be the first 2 people to ever, officially, be entombed on Hogwarts grounds. Well, since it had been a school at least. Rumors of mass graves from invading forces and of graveyards for the older inhabitants of the castle from the many centuries before it was a school didn't count. On account of them being unverified, he couldn't come up with anything to say. He'd already said it all in the chamber when he had wept for them, wept for somebody else for the first time in his life. As far as he knew, for the first time in either of his lives. But he would find out in time if that was true. If the other him he absorbed from Harry really did wind up sharing his memories in time. He looked up and about. Nearly everybody had already left, mostly because the student curfew didn't change for the funeral. The head boy was still meandering about, either one of his menders or deciding to be on patrol of the grounds for students sneaking out that night. He had a little spy scope to watch the grounds nearer the castle, so probably the latter. It made sense for the tombs to get a specific prefect patrol. The idea of somebody vandalizing them was enough to make his blood boil. Hagrid was standing nearby too, watching him. The half-giant had been his most consistent and gleeful minder. When he found out from Harry's memories that his old framing had gotten the lovable man not only expelled, but also put in Azkaban, he understood why. As if his crime laying in the earth before him wasn't reason enough to hate him and make sure he didn't get away to do more damage. "What will happen to me?" he asked loud enough for Hagrid to hear. Hagrid sighed and seemed to take pity on him. "Look, I've been thinking, and we all know you're not going to have an easy time of it going forward," Hagrid admitted. "You now have all of the weight on Lil Harry's shoulders and all of his enemies to worry about. And you owe the world so much, I don't know how you're ever going to repay those debts. But I imagine it'll be in the form of pain. A lot of pain, and you will pay in it. Not because we'll me making ye, but because you must." Hagrid always had the power to put in simple words the totality of exceptionally complex turmoil or issues. And he was right. He was always right. Came with being so honest and kind, Tom supposed. It also perfectly and succinctly summarized his own thoughts. "There's going to be a lot of blood, isn't there?" Tom asked. "Aye," Hagrid confirmed. "A lot of it will be mine, won't it?" Tom clarified. "And sweat. And tears." "Yeah," Hagrid answered stoically. Tom withdrew his wand from his robe pocket. Harry's wand. The Hollywood felt as natural as his old one, but weighed so much more than any other wand made in history. Save, maybe, the smooth and twisty wand of Minerva he had holstered to his ankle. "Bring it on," Tom declared, staring back up at the tombs. Then came the sirens. Tom, Hagrid, and the head boy 20 or so yards away all stared up at the castle that had come to life. Bright lights on the exterior walls as a siren rang out into the night. They watched as the bright white light of the siege wards slowly fell around the castle like a protective bubble. Before any of them could even wonder aloud what was going on, a Phoenix Patronus darted from the castle to the tomb, and Dumbledore's authoritative voice told them everything. "Azkaban has fallen. All prisoners and Aurors are either dead, captured, or released. The war has begun again, far faster than any of us could have guessed. The entire country is under martial law. Ensure everybody gets inside before the wards lock them out." With its message delivered, the Patronus faded out of existence. They all jumped into action. "I'll circle around the lake on the left. Make sure there aren't any stragglers." The head boy yelled at them before sprinting off. "We've got the right. Make prodigious use of hominum revelio." Tom yelled back. He shared a glance with Hagrid, and they both nodded. He withdrew his umbrella wand, and they both were off. Tom sprinted flat out to try and keep up with Hagrid's massive strides, but keep up he did. They cast our area hominum revelio charms into the forest as they ran past it. House elves popped in and out of existence all around them, searching for any stragglers. The mermaids of the lake peeked over the surface and curiously called to them in the clicking language. "Va!" Hagrid yelled back to them. "Prepare yourselves." They nodded and disappeared back beneath the murky water. They need not have wasted energy on the spells, because the only two people they encountered out past curfew were a couple that already got the message from a house elf and were sprinting towards the castle themselves. Their sprint back to the castle was punctuated by the slow descent of the ward, like melted golden chocolate over an invisible sphere. They crossed into the great courtyard just as it finished falling around them, and its light faded. They looked out on the now dead silent grounds as they caught their breath. No invading army, no fires, no booms. Of course, Azkaban was far away, and there was no reason to expect whatever was going on there would make a beeline here, but still, when I said bring it on, I didn't mean right this second. Tom said in his best attempt at humor. "Want your story written? I take commissions now. You can pay me to write your fanfiction or original works. My prices are as follows. $25 per 1,000 words of fanfiction, with some wiggle room. I don't pad my work. You also get to video chat with me as I type the first chapter. $25 per 500 words for original works, so anything that is not fanfiction. I also charge $25 per 500 words for smut or fetish materials. Price is subject to change in the future. Check with me. Become a patron. Nonsensical Rants. You can also still become a patron for $1 to get access to future chapters 2 weeks early and vote on which stories I update next. 11. Emptied Prisons. Chapter 11. Emptied Prisons. Regulus and his cohort of Inner Circle Death Eaters were led back up onto the grounds just as the worst of the rain subsided. Smoking craters and dead horrors decorated the grassy hills and stone outcroppings. Or more accurately, bits and pieces of horrors decorated them. Hey, www. The fighting is over. Bella whined. Fear not, came a familiar, sultry voice. There is much more fighting to come, and your safety took priority over your enjoyment. Severus? Regulus asked before he even saw the man. At the sight of his open arms, Regulus embraced his friend in the most gratifying hold he'd had in over a decade. It is so good to see you again, Reggie, Severus said. Soon enough, mutual pats on the back told them both that the hug had lasted long enough, and they separated. Severus, holding Regulus by the shoulders, looked him up and down and seemed displeased with his condition. Regulus couldn't blame him. He wasn't particularly pleased with his condition either. Regulus returned the look, similarly displeased with the state Severus was in. Regulus had been in prison, Severus had not. And yet the unwashedness, exhaustion, and absolute despondency seeping out of every pore on his friend's body was absolute and soul-crushing. Before he could comment on it, Severus broke the silence. "Where is your brother?" Severus asked. "He is standing before me," Regulus exclaimed without hesitation, motioning to Severus. Severus smiled, and the obvious exhaustion and despair emanating from his body died down slightly. "It means more than you could imagine to hear you say that, my friend," Severus said. "And if I were in a more humorous mood, I would surely say you're delusional from your time around Dementors. But for now, I'll take the moment for what it was. But seriously, where is Sirius Black?" "Gone," Barty said. "Escaped before we arrived. We know not how." Severus said thoughtfully, unhanding Regulus and stepping to the side in thought. "It seems too great of a coincidence that he would escape today, of all days. I would suspect Albus, but I don't think it likely. He never knew of Sirius' innocence. Did anybody see his escape?" Before Regulus and the other prisoners could say no, another voice, gruff and growling and inhuman, broke through the darkness. "I did," came the growl. They all turned to the voice, and, even knowing he was in full control, they all backed away from the fully transformed Fenrir Greyback. He slinked towards them on all fours, teeth permanently bared by the unfortunate tautness of his transformed face. When he reached Severus, he stood on his hind legs. "In the cafeteria," Fenrir explained. "He was unarmed, and I thought I had him, but he is an animagi." Regulus barely managed to keep a calm face at the revelation. "Damn it, Siri. Did you really have to give away your biggest advantage to the enemy? The form of a large black dog." "Yes, I know," said Severus. "One large enough to handle a werewolf, one-on-one." They all looked at Severus with surprise at the revelation. He chuckled at their questioning looks. "I had a close encounter with Lupin on a full moon back in my 5th year at Hogwarts. Potter saved me," he explained, in his animagi form, that of a stag. "In the 2 years after that, I kept very close attention on the Marauders and learned that all but Remus were animagi. And I learned their forms. All right, that's what Sirius and his crew called themselves back in school. Really dumb name, but wow. Scary of you, Severus. Bit obsessed with them, don't you think? Speaking of Pettigrew, he has returned from the dead." Severus went on. "Well, I forced him out of hiding. In fact, I forced a lot of people to come out of hiding. That's what made all of this possible." He motioned to indicate the carnage around them, and Regulus believed him. "Pettigrew is alive?" Regulus whispered to himself. "Indeed," said Severus. "And his cooperation is contingent on your brother not remaining so. Knowing your animosity, I would ask you to help hunt him down, but you are in no shape to do so at the moment." Regulus smiled in mock thankfulness and bowed his head in honest tiredness. The hymn from before Azkaban would have been overjoyed to be handed a wand and the mission to hunt his brother down and kill him. Now, after over a decade learning to love the man again and sharing such an important mission, no, he needed to make sure the hunting party in question had a false lead. As such, Fenrir, you and your pack are to hunt him down. Tonight, Sirius commanded before reaching into his robes to pull out a sack. Here are more of my specially made truffles for you. You will need them to stay in control. Oh, so that's how he'd slipped them wolfsbane potions. Your care packages have been a lifesaver, Regulus told him. Sirius nodded dispassionately before turning back on Fenrir. Do you have any leads on which direction he escaped the island? Sirius asked. Indeed. I witnessed him paddling southward towards England. Fenrir said. I could not follow him hoping to swim and catch up, but if you can get us to the mainland, my pack and I can pick up his trail. South? That didn't add up. The plan was for him to go north to Godric's Hollow for one of his and James' emergency caches of food and supplies from before Voldemort's fall. Why would he be going south? Unless he had swum south to give a false lead to anybody watching and was planning to steer back northward? Very dangerous thing to attempt in such choppy weather. Then it shall be so, Sirius said, motioning for the three men some distance behind him to come forth. They did as he wanted, and as they approached, Regulus recognized them. Barely. Lucius, Regulus asked tiredly. Karkaroff, Rookwood snarled, enraged at the sight of the stool pigeon. Rosier, Antonin and Bella asked at the same time. Yet another person back from the dead. Sirius said with a knowing smile. And another forced back into the fold. But I ask you to find it in your hearts to forgive our friend Igor. After all, he has prepared for you all a nice, warm castle to recover in over the summer. He motioned for them to follow, and they did, walking the entire length of the island and eventually into a crowd of other prisoners. Just all of them, organized on either side by sex as people unknown to them took stock of their identities and offered them a place in the Dark Lord's forces, or so Regulus presumed. He had still seen no sign of the Dark Lord, and for this kind of thing, he would normally take care of things in a more hands-on style. Make way, Lucius hollered. Heroes coming through. Regulus smirked at Malfoy's antics, noticing they were completely unnecessary as everyone backed away at the sight of the werewolves flanking them. They passed through the crowd and came upon a wooden ship that seemed almost ethereal. The gangway was already lowered, and being dragged on board by other servants of Voldemort was, of all people, Caltrod. The goblin was bound and gagged, and held not a single bruise, cut, or scrape. Had he really not fought back at all? And where was his cudgel? I'm sure you are also all eager to exact some retribution on the good warden. Sirius said, but that will have to wait. We have a long voyage ahead of us, and you all have a long recovery ahead of that. For those easily seasick, I will personally provide draught of living death. And that would be yet a greater distance for Regulus to escape. This situation just kept getting worse. Tom watched from the head table as the red-robed Aurors ran around the castle, like chickens with their heads chopped off. The other teachers were also all in the process of herding many sleepy and pajama-clad students down to the entrance hall and Great Hall. The moment the wards finished forming Dumbledore had come down to reopen a section of them for the literal army of Aurors that just arrived. Then he had to key them into the flue so they could leave and come back with parents. And thus, similarly sleep and pajama-clad adults started swarming in through the staff fireplaces. This included all 14 teacher fireplaces, Dumbledore's office, Pomfrey's hospital wing, and most surprisingly, Filch's office and the library, or more specifically Man in Pants' little office to the side of the library. Neither Tom nor Harry had ever known Hogwarts had so many flue connections, but today at least the 18 it did have was barely sufficient. The entire Weasley family was already at Hogwarts for their daughter's ceremony and had been put up in the visitor suite, so they had gathered up their brood and left before the first set of parents even arrived. Tom didn't have the chance to say goodbye to them. He felt that was probably for the best. The Muggle-born students, or those who notably did not have flue addresses listed on their student files, had all been brought down to the Great Hall, but not before they had overheard what the Aurors were telling parents and parents their children. They seemed quite sure it's Voldemort who did it. Hermione said from where she popped a squat beside him at the head table in her pink, heart-studded pajamas. There were no faculty around. They were busy manning the fireplaces, so it was just Lord of the Flies and a few overtaxed Aurors who were not trained for childcare. Attacking Azkaban out of the blue. A nearby Auror clarified. Doesn't sound like him. Last time he was more subtle, disappearing people and chipping away at society. Big attacks like this only came near the end of his reign. Tom was so surprised to have missed the older man's presence that he felt his usual flash of anger cross his face, anger at himself for missing a potential threat. Somehow, Harry's memories and feelings didn't contradict Tom's instincts towards law enforcement. Should file that away for later psychological analysis. I mean, do we have any first-hand witnesses of the event? Tom asked. Of course. They're still probably being debriefed and/or attended to medically. The Auror said, all we know is what we've been told. That Azkaban was attacked and emptied. Tom wasn't exactly knowledgeable on Voldemort's tactics during his first rise, either from Tom Riddle's or Harry Potter's memories, so he'd have to take the Auror's word for it. Still, this left the Muggleborns hanging out to dry. How were they planning to get them all home? They couldn't take the Hogwarts Express. It would make too juicy of a target for a large-scale attack. A train full of nothing but Muggleborns? Yeah, not a good thing to tempt Voldemort with. Are you planning to individually apparate each Muggleborn to their own doorstep? Tom asked. We are indeed, said the Auror. As soon as we've alerted all of the parents to what's going on and scheduled for their return home. Mystery solved. And once that was done, the Aurors and Ministry could absolve themselves of responsibility for the children and focus their efforts on war. Oh, Hermione cooed. I've never operated before. Well, it's not the best experience. Tom warned. So don't get too excited. Sure thing, Dudley. Hermione said before yawning and curling up in McGonagall's chair. Tom let the jab go, marveling in appreciation at the comfortable padding charms affixed to Dumbledore's throne. They sure were making the most of this crisis. He wondered for a moment which house won the House Cup, and wondered further if any student at all cared. It was then that Dumbledore himself, shaken and tired, entered the great hall, and the loud chatter of sleep-excited students died down at the sight of him. He looked dispassionately to the head table and at Tom, motioning for him to come. Well, this might be goodbye for now, Hermione. Tom said. She hummed. Happy to be hospitalized with you again sometime. She said, and I look forward to more grand adventures in deep dark dungeons with you and your friends. Tom said honestly before climbing down from the head table and following Dumbledore out. I have been robbed, Dumbledore told him. My wand has been stolen. Tom blinked at the ancient man. Why would anybody want to steal your wand? He asked. Surely Ollivander can provide you a worthy replacement, and you'll be just as dangerous. Albus analyzed him, as if trying to determine if he knew more, and for once Tom didn't. It is a long story, and one I don't think you're ready for. It is not actually my original wand. I still have the same wand Garrett's father matched me with as a boy. But I fear Severus is behind the attack on Azkaban. He said, as he would be able to answer that question. I have similarly bad news. Harry's cloak has also been stolen. Whoa, Snape? Stealing from Dumbledore and attacking Azkaban? That seemed out of character even for his smarmy ass. Then again, as Tom scoured through Harry's memories of the guy, he himself, the half of him that was Riddle, couldn't quite get a read on him. His hatred for Harry seemed half-hearted at best and seemed more like a spying type of situation, which now that he knew he was a Death Eater made sense. He was keeping an eye on the enemy for when Voldemort returned, and he hid behind an antagonistic role for it. Then the second half of what Dumbledore said struck him, and he felt a rage, not his own, boil in his stomach. That greasy bat stole my FA. He stopped himself, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. Stole Harry's cloak? The only thing left of his father. Dumbledore looked at him with concern after the slip-up there. In all reality, Tom knew he should have been more concerned by it too, but he was actively trying not to most days. Indeed, I now fear your other half is of less concern than him. Dumbledore warned, as I am certain he wishes you dead personally, and myself as well. I'm sorry, sir. I'm really not following here. If he was a Death Eater, Shouldn't he be seeking me out to restore my mind? Tom asked in genuine confusion. And I'm sorry, but even with his recent betrayal of both Voldemort and myself, I cannot in good conscience share his personal demons with you. Dumbledore said. But suffice to say, he has not served Voldemort since before Harry Potter's birth. And now I failed him in all I owed him. He has left me. I betrayed him enough already. I won't do so any further. Wow, really showing that much loyalty to a man who robbed you and started a war? Dumbledore would never make sense to him. So what? Where am I supposed to go for the summer if Snape is after me and has Azkaban's prison population? Tom asked. I mean, I can't just go back to Privet Drive, and I'm sure Wool's orphanage isn't around anymore. The return of the normally present twinkle to Dumbledore's eye brought with it ill tidings, and Tom knew he wouldn't like the answer. I have decided that for your protection, you ought to be placed in the last place anybody, even Sirius, would think to look for you. Dumbledore told him. Tom looked across the table at the familiar, batty woman. There was no way, no earthly possibility that Arabella Figg was a witch, and yet he had just come out of her fireplace by Fleur from Dumbledore's office, and she seemed nonplussed by the magic. She did, however, seem very uncomfortable by his awkward presence and shameless staring. Even as Tibbles and Snowball happily used his legs and feet as face scratchers, he continued to stare. So, she asked, at as clear of a loss as he was. Would you like a beer? Yes, Tom said in a broken voice, a little too loudly. Yes, I would. The sun was only now rising over the Austrian mountainscape. It was a slow sunrise made slower by the even higher mountains above the castle that kept the sunlight at bay, only illuminating distant peaks and keeping the pits and valleys shrouded in darkness. This suited Peter Pettigrew fine. Even as a rat, he felt exposed and vulnerable scurrying between the lifeless rocks and numerous patrols around the castle prison. But scurry he did, and he arrived at the castle gates unharmed and undetected, like any rat. For the greater good, RE the inscription in the stone archway above the gate. Peter could have laughed at the lie of a mantra, one that evil men had told themselves to justify the evil in their hearts. Peter would know. He had done such evils with such motivations, and was doing so now as well. Protective wards against rats were standard for most places, save those so thick with layers upon layers of wards that it might conflict with more important protections. So, most wizards relied on good, old-fashioned mousetraps. Naturally, this gave Wormtail free rein to enter and explore even the most well-protected places in the world. Even places Nermengard. Want your story written? I take commissions now. You can pay me to write your fanfiction or original works. My prices are as follows. $25 per 1,000 words of fanfiction, with some wiggle room. I don't pad my work. You also get to video chat with me as I type the first chapter. $25 per 500 words for original works, so anything that is not fanfiction. I also charge $25 per 500 words for smut or fetish materials. Price is subject to change in the future. Check with me. Become a patron. NonsensicalRants. You can also still become a patron for $1 to get access to future chapters 2 weeks early and vote on which stories I update next.